The Innovating Equity Summit is brought to you today by the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, but it's also brought to you by some important sponsors. The Innovating Equity Summit would like to thank our thought leader sponsors, the San Francisco 49ers, Genentech, and Blue Shield of California. The Innovating Equity Summit would also like to thank our innovator level sponsors, Bloom Energy, Deloitte, Lyft, and United Airlines. The Innovating Equity Summit would also like to thank our important media sponsors, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Silicon Valley Business Journal, the Bay Area News Group, and the San Francisco Business Times. Finally, the Innovating Equity Summit would like to thank our production sponsor for their amazing technical support today, Zoom. And finally, to our audience, speakers, and guests, we thank you for your support.
Inclusion, diversity, representation, equity. We're in the middle of a moment and a national conversation. In our culture, in our communities, in our leading companies. But that moment is perishable, which is why Silicon Valley Leadership Group is committed to catalyzing the conversation into commitment, bringing together diverse voices in business, policy, and advocacy. Welcome to the Innovating Equity Summit from SVLG, moving from intent to action, presented by the San Francisco 49ers, Genentech, and Blue Shield of California.
Thank you for joining us today for the Innovating Equity Summit. Coming up soon is a special opening keynote conversation with Ariel Investments' Melody Hobson and HP's Enrique Lores. Later, a special conversation with MLT's John Rice. And coming right up is our opening with U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development Secretary Marcia L. Fudge. But right now, it's our own SVLG CEO, Ahmad Thomas.
Good morning. On behalf of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our Innovating Equity Summit. Today, we'll have the opportunity to hear thought-provoking conversations about the systemic challenges and also the opportunities we face in creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive future for Silicon Valley and corporate America. This program and the companies engaged to advance this dialogue, Genentech, the 49ers, Blue Shield of California, you heard, along with so many others, are indicative of a foundational shift underway towards a new vision of corporate citizenship for Silicon Valley. SVLG members are among the vanguard of companies pioneering a new form of Silicon Valley leadership, one focused as a core pillar on creating a more inclusive future for all. This transformation is driven by a new cohort of CEOs who share a deep commitment to doing the right thing because it is the right thing. Silicon Valley is recognized around the world as the leading hub for innovation and disruption. And our business community now must be the driver, as we have left a lot of points on the board and lag behind on disrupting the status quo in terms of talent and leadership. The business case for diversity is clear and long established. It is our charge to ensure that the necessary change and progress you will hear about today continues and accelerates. We must innovate around equity, just as we do with our technology. It's just that fundamental. This is why SVLG and our members have prioritized a bold DEI agenda to catalyze change and transform the face of business leadership in the Valley. Our work centers around three core areas: board diversity, inclusion and belonging, and public policy. And the progress of our companies over the last year is reflected in some of the following initiatives, which I'll highlight. The Next Generation Board Network, the Pledge 25 by 25 initiative, and some of the public policy work that SVLG and its member companies have really taken a leadership position around. If we take them one by one, board diversity. In August, SVLG launched the Next Generation Board Network, an industry-leading board readiness program for diverse executives, sponsored by EY and Equilar. And we partnered with the top affinity organizations in the country, including Ascend, Athena Alliance, Boulé, Latino Corporate Board Directors Association, and Out Network, to create a cohort of terrific, diverse leaders who are poised to become the next generation of influential board directors right here in Silicon Valley, paving the way for a bright future and a future for change. Pledge 25 by 25, it's a groundbreaking, comprehensive approach with the potential to create real measurable impact, starting in Silicon Valley and reverberating throughout corporate America. What 25 by 25 does for all participating companies, there's a commitment to having at least 25% of leadership comprised of underrepresented leaders by 2025. Some of the region's largest and most influential employers have supported the pledge, including Genentech, the San Francisco 49ers, Twitter, our social media partner, Alaska Airlines, Western Digital, and SunPower. It's across industries. And these companies are deploying solutions that consider hiring metrics, education and awareness building, inclusion, and direct investment, all as part of uplifting and supporting our communities of color and driving greater business results. We recognize there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to DEI, and that many companies are at different points in their DEI journey. So to help catalyze change, we'll be sharing lessons learned and best practices from our member companies in the coming months. We know there's more work to be done, but SVLG and our companies are committed to just that, action. And this summit is about how we innovate to produce the results in line with our commitment to doing our part to change the future of business for good. There's no time to waste. And with that, let me now turn to our first speaker, who I am truly honored to welcome, the Honorable Marcia L. Fudge, U.S. Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Secretary Fudge has devoted her career to public service in fighting for low-income families, seniors, and communities across the country, most recently serving as U.S. Representative for the 11th Congressional District of Ohio. She is also the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. We're delighted to welcome such a distinguished leader to kick off today's program.
Thank you, President Thomas. Thanks as well to the entire membership of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group for all you do to advance racial justice and equity in America's boardrooms and America's communities. It is my pleasure to take part in your inaugural Innovating Equity Summit. The Biden-Harris administration is eager to partner with each of you to forge a fairer, more just, and more equitable America. President Joe Biden has embedded a commitment to diversity and equity at every level of his administration. He has assembled the most diverse cabinet in history. It includes the first Black vice president, the first Black secretary of defense, the first woman of color to chair the Council of Economic Advisors and the first Native American cabinet secretary. The president has elevated the voices of diverse leaders throughout his administration. In fact, African Americans represent more than half of his nominees to serve as U.S. attorneys and nearly 1/3 of his nominees to the federal bench. I am proud to serve in an administration that centers its work around the guiding principle of equity. On his first day in office, the president signed an executive order directing our government to explore solutions for advancing racial justice. Since then, we have worked with intentionality to deliver support and expand opportunities for people of color. We provided vital relief to families who fell behind during the pandemic, distributed vaccines for COVID, and took bold actions to empower communities of color. The president has issued a once-in-a-generation plan known as Build Back Better. Build Back Better will dramatically expand access to affordable child care and elder care, reduce healthcare premiums for 9 million Americans, and invest billions of dollars to support schools that serve historically underserved communities, including HBCUs. There's more, much more. Build Back Better contains the largest and most comprehensive investment in affordable housing in history. It provides $150 billion to create, preserve, and restore more than 1 million homes in big cities, small towns, tribal nations, and rural communities. Build Back Better will help hundreds of thousands of Americans purchase their first homes and build a source of wealth they can pass down to their children and their children's children. It will address the major capital needs of America's public housing and deliver life-changing rental assistance to hundreds of thousands of families. Build Back Better will remedy policies that perpetuate systemic inequality. This administration will break down barriers that prevent people of color from moving into neighborhoods with good schools and good jobs, healthier homes, and cleaner air. The president's plan builds upon HUD's efforts to level the playing field. We know the burden of student loans is particularly heavy for Americans of color, so we have made it easier for borrowers with student loans to qualify for a HUD-insured mortgage. We will help more first-generation Americans and people of color with down payments on their first homes. As Secretary, enforcing the Fair Housing Act is a top priority. HUD will work to root out systemic racism from our housing market, including our appraisal market. The Biden-Harris administration is proud to partner with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group to champion racial justice. I know we can count on your support on all our efforts, from elevating diverse leaders to advocating for Build Back Better and advancing racial equity in our housing. Together, we can provide every American with a fair chance to thrive, regardless of the color of their skin or the zip code where they are born. Thank you very much and have a wonderful summit.
Hi, my name is Courtney Louisi, Director of Operations. At SVLG, we believe that building diversity and inclusion into structures at every level makes for fundamentally better organizations. But how to catalyze that transformation, especially at a moment of change, very often comes down to leadership. We're lucky to have not one, but two of the most impactful leaders in this space to talk about how we get there. Individuals widely regarded as the leading Black and Latinx voices on corporate diversity. Melody Hobson is the president and co-CEO of Ariel Investments, one of the most recognized funds in the industry and a company that has over $15.5 billion in assets under management. She is chair of the board of directors for Starbucks Corporation and serves on multiple corporate boards, including JP Morgan Chase. Melody is a powerhouse in business and also a force when it comes to conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Time magazine put her on their list of 25 business influentials that are setting global standards for management, ethics, and innovation. Joining Ms. Hobson is another powerhouse on multiple levels, Enrique Lores. He is the president and CEO of HP Inc., a Fortune 100 company with operations in more than 170 countries. With a 30-year HP career, Enrique's efforts have been deeply rooted around HP's values. This includes the company's sustainable impact strategy, as well as their commitment to a dynamic and diverse workforce. A proven tech industry veteran, Enrique believes in strong teams and empowering people. Driving today's conversation will be our own CEO, Ahmad Thomas. After stepping into his leadership role as SBLG's first Black CEO a little over a year ago, Ahmad has hit the ground running, driving initiatives in business competitiveness, climate, and our signature diversity initiative, Pledge 25 by 25. With a career at the intersection of business, politics, and equity, I'm sure he'll drive a great conversation. Welcome, Melody Hobson, Enrique Lores, and Ahmad Thomas.
Melody, Enrique, we are just thrilled to have you here today as part of the Innovating Equity Summit at Silicon Valley Leadership Group. We could not have a better set of leaders to talk about DEI and the issues facing corporate America and Silicon Valley. So right off the bat, I want to say a huge thank you and welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you.
Well, Melody, I'll start with you. Our last conversation, you were pretty open and direct about Silicon Valley, about DEI across our companies, and where there was room for improvement and work to be done. Now, I don't want a report card per se, unless you want to go in that direction, but just to level set, where in your view do we stand around DEI here in Silicon Valley today?
I think there's a long way to go. I sit in San Francisco right now in the Ariel San Francisco office, so I'm not speaking as an outsider. I'm speaking as someone who is close by in proximity. And my assessment from both being in the Valley and also around the Valley is that there is a lot of talk, there's a lot of activity. The action and the actual results are still wanting. We have a very long way to go, particularly in the tech sector, to line up the outcomes with the desires. And the reason that I push so hard on this issue is because I think of all the sectors out there that have innovated and have forced meaningful change, that have disrupted in ways that none of us thought was imaginable. It's been Silicon Valley and the technology space. And yet, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think the industry is lagging woefully. And one good example, Enrique is here, who's a phenomenal leader and a great example of diversity, equity, and inclusion at work in terms of true success for someone who has earned it. But you can't point to a lot of senior leaders in Silicon Valley who are diverse.
That's a fact. And Melody, I think that's a good segue for Enrique. And Enrique, as you know, I do not believe in corporate America, at least, there is a better speaker around diversity and the issues we are confronting than Melody. Melody, the way you speak truth to power, how compelling you are. I think that this dialogue could not be more important than it is today. And so, Enrique, I wouldn't ask you in any way to maybe critique what Melody has said. I'd be curious about your experience, your lived experience around the Valley, working your way up from an intern. Where do you see DEI around our companies in Silicon Valley currently?
So first of all, thank you for having me here. And it's a big honor to be in the same panel than Melody. And I actually cannot critique what she said, because I agree very strongly that if this was a pass-fail system, the Valley would be failing today in diversity and inclusion. And I think many of the conversations that we are having now, or that we have been having in the last year and a half, are conversations that should have happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And the actions that we are starting to take now are actions that should have been taken many, many months or years before. So I think we have failed. On the positive side, though, I think more and more people and more leaders are aware that this is an area where we need to drive change, where we need to set aggressive objectives and align our companies to drive this change. This is what we are doing in HP, and this is what is being done in many other companies. But despite the progress that has happened recently, we have a long way to go to where we think any company in the technology space or not in the technology space should be in terms of diversity and inclusion.
Well, Enrique, looking at, so the assessment is clear. We've got a long way to go. I think we're all on the same page there. When we pivot and look at the accelerants to change, right? And obviously, Enrique, you're making big strides at HP. But Melody, I think of ESG and ESG investments where we've seen, it's a multi-trillion-dollar global market around environment and sustainability. In no way am I equating the two. I don't know if perhaps for executives and investors, environment is easier to jump into than DEI. But if you look at a successful movement, Melody, like ESG, following that capital, what can we learn from that around DEI? And from your seat, obviously your investment and institutional investment experience, where are some of those key learning points for DEI movement and momentum?
That is a great question because I've thought about this a lot. When you talk about ESG, environmental, social governance, the DEI conversation falls within the social, and I would suggest the governance verticals of ESG. But interestingly, when you rank order these things, there's no question that ESG has a bias towards the E. I often think of the E as being in a capital letter and the S and G become successively smaller in emphasis. And I think part of the reason for that is because of the external demands around the issue of climate. They make a lot of sense. The customers, the regulators, the community is demanding action in this area. That has put a tremendous amount of pressure on corporate America as well as corporations globally. And at the end of the day, they have to respond to that pressure. Proxy vote resolutions, all sorts of things have happened in that regard. And suddenly that conversation has really taken off. I think that we are waiting for that to happen in the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have not seen that same pressure. We've not seen that same internal pressure from people or external pressure, but I think it's coming because of the virtual nature of the society that we have today. You have nowhere to hide. If you say it and you don't mean it or deliver, people will come for you. That is the society we live in now. Our employees will walk out. We've seen that happen in Silicon Valley. So a result of that, I think the day of reckoning is coming. And to the extent that corporations do not take this issue seriously with actions as well as opposed to just talk, I think that they are looking at some harder days ahead. I've said this many times, and I really do believe it, to the extent that you want to be a world-class 21st century company and you do not truly have a diverse workforce, do not truly have diverse leadership or diverse board, you're committing corporate suicide. And it's not a question of if you will die, it's a question of when. And yes, it can take a very long time, but it doesn't end well.
Well, Melody, to double click on your point about actions and acting now, do you believe Silicon Valley in particular versus New York, the financial sector, many of the other leading industries and regions, do you believe that we have been behind? Or is the comment more generally that across corporate sectors, we have to make this progress now? Do we have a starting point that is behind some of the other industries and sectors?
I do think so. Now, I think one good move and one good outcome is that the reporting is now happening in a widespread way. Again, that's been demanded. Corporations have had to respond to pressures on reporting on these issues. And so now at least we have some transparency around the numbers, but that is not enough. Awareness is not enough. And now to go from that, to develop concrete policies that get at scale. The one thing that is amazing about the tech sector and Silicon Valley in general is that you solve really hard problems. I mean, hard. We have tourists going to space right now. These are hard things. And when you think about applying that same sort of ingenuity to break through ideas in diversity and equity and inclusion, this is where I would expect it to come from. And yet we've seen more of the same, policies and practices that will lead to incremental, not the scale change that the Valley is famous for.
Well, Enrique, your position is unique. HP has one of the most diverse board of directors around. And you've made several big announcements, doubling your Black executive population by 2025. So as Melody says, math has no opinion. Clearly you've got those metrics in place. What is working? What's not? What are your takeaways so far as you set, to Melody's point, some goals that are a little more ambitious than your peers?
Well, certainly having a diverse executive team and a diverse board help, because it's very visible to us the value that we can get by really building a more diverse company. But probably the number one lesson beyond that is that there is strong demand for this. More and more, our investors are asking for this. Our customers are asking for a more diverse company, a company that represents our consumers. And our employees are demanding that as well. So there is a clear need from all our stakeholders to move in this direction. And we need to take advantage of that and drive action, as Melody was saying. I think when we look at why more progress have not happened in the last years, there are some reasons that I think we all need to listen to, but at the same time reject. We many times hear that there are not enough candidates to create a more diverse workforce. Well, there are not enough candidates because we don't look for them in the right places, or we don't put enough energy looking for them. And this is clearly something that we have changed. We, for example, are working with HBCUs to every time more and more to create a diverse pool of candidates that we can attract to the company. I think also we need to make sure that the leaders of the companies are accountable for driving this change and for these goals. We need to make sure that in the same way executives have a goal for revenue, profit, or growth in certain segments, right, we need to measure and define goals in terms of diversity and how are they improving the diversity of the goals. And this is something we have done, and this is something we pay executives based on. And finally, as Melody was saying, we need to increase transparency, because one of the things that is more difficult to do today is to compare companies that are making progress with companies that are not making progress. And I think defining the right metrics that all of us will have to report, I think is going to help to increase the mobilization and to increase more companies, to drive more companies to drive change.
If I could just follow up on that, I can't.
Please, Melody, yeah.
There are just so many things buried in that answer that are so important and just worth at least taking a moment to even take a bit further. So this idea that we read annual reports for a living at Ariel, the number of annual reports that say diversity is, quote, a strategic imperative. That is literally the line that you read over and over again. Every other strategic imperative inside of a corporation is directly tied to incentives. If EPS, profitability, product launch dates, I can go on and on. You get what you incent in corporate America. So I always say to people, if diversity is a strategic imperative, can you have a superstar in your company, like truly a superstar, get their full bonus and not have a diverse team? If the answer is yes, it's not a strategic imperative. And you're misleading the reader in that regard. So that's one piece of it. That incentive piece is so important. The other idea is this pipeline discussion. I think there is so much over rotation to the pipeline. We're constantly talking about the pipeline. And I remember one white executive said to me, which I thought was brilliant. He's like, you know what's great about the pipeline? No competition when you're senior. And I was like, that's right. He's like, we'd like to talk about the pipeline all day long. Pipeline is great, but if no one, those young Black and brown people that you're recruiting from those HBCUs or wherever they may come from, if they don't see anyone at the top, they're not staying. They want to know that they can be successful, that they can get to the highest level of organizations. So then there becomes a conversation about there are not enough engineers graduating. And I say, one thing we do, we go to law school. Black and Latinx, Hispanics, we've been lawyers for 40 years. You know, we can be general counsels. We can be heads of marketing. There are a whole host of areas where you can show senior leadership in that senior suite that will inspire those young people who come into the organization. And I would say Enrique's numbers are probably moving because he's there. He's him, and it becomes a beacon for those young people who say, wow, one day I could run the company, just like I think happens at Ariel.
Well, I'm very curious on that last point, and maybe it gets a little more personal. For me, I'm new as a CEO only a year, but I don't see people who look like me on calls, and I'm fortunate to talk to a lot of CEOs in this role. We have the top Black corporate voice, top brown, Hispanic corporate voice in America on this call today, and unfortunately, it's a pretty small pool to pick from. Enrique, do you think maybe 30 plus years at HP, intern all the way up, you got 50,000 plus employees. Is there a different standard for you? Do you feel that you've got a responsibility that might be different from your predecessors, given your Hispanic heritage?
Well, I'm not sure if it is different, but I clearly feel the responsibility. I think that many times I tell my story that I started in the company as an intern, and I was able and lucky enough to grow through it. And I share it because I know it's motivating for new people that is joining the company, diverse people that think, oh, this will never happen. And I tell you, if someone with my accent can be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, everybody can do it. And I think it's important for me, for Melody, to share our stories, because there is nothing more motivational than that for young employees. And this is also one way to attract talent to the company, because they see what is possible, and if they are motivated for having a strong career, this clearly will help us also to join the company. So I feel the responsibility, and I use my story as much as I can because I think it can make a difference.
Well, it's an incredible story. And this kind of needles at me a little bit. And Melody, I'd be very curious about your perspective. I sometimes feel if we look at our Black community, if we look at our Latinx brothers and sisters, that sometimes there's almost competition. That might be too strong a word. But sometimes we're not fully aligned at trying to bring each of us up at the same time. Now, there's a very different set of systemic issues that different groups in this country have faced that you both know well. And Melody, I'd be curious about your perspective around how minority groups can work together to try and drive change, because it can't be all Black women, it can't be all Hispanic males. We have to find a way for Black and brown communities to drive this change, particularly because we have so few of you all out there.
I couldn't agree with you more. And the only way that is going to work is for us to work together, for us to understand this is not a zero-sum game for anyone. It's not a zero-sum game for a white man who may be threatened by this diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, or for minority groups who are in such small numbers in these organizations, also trying to expand their presence and reputation inside of companies. What I find so interesting is oftentimes when companies, particularly in the Valley, report their diversity numbers, it's a multicultural umbrella. They put every ethnicity together, and then they report this number that I'm like, And even oftentimes they throw gender in there too, because the women are underrepresented in the technology space. So they put this multicultural umbrella out there, and I'm like, no, that's not allowed. You need to cut the data by ethnicity. And in so doing, you see the underrepresentation. You see where the numbers really are, and that has happened more and more. Once you do that, we need to be aligned and understand that working together is how we move forward, not being pitted against each other or thinking there's only room for one of us. I think that's been the problem. You see that on boards. You see that in also they want a Black director. They want a Latinx director. And it's so interesting to me because I've given this thought experiment many times. If I showed you the board of a huge company, let's just say it's ExxonMobil, and every single board member was Black, you would say, what is up with that? You would have this visceral reaction, right? But we don't have that reaction to all white male boards, or especially in some of the private companies that haven't even gone public yet. And then we have this idea that one becomes sufficient, as opposed to thinking through that more can be better, so that we don't end up thinking, well, I need to get the one seat or the one opportunity that's going to be given. Our numbers don't even reflect that. I want the diversity statistics to track the demographics of our society. If it did, we wouldn't be doing this, picking and choosing around one minority group.
Well, that's very well said, Melody. And Enrique, I would love to hear your perspective and maybe in particular around your approach to HP. You know, Melody has talked about the data, how important that is. Obviously, the quantitative analytical piece is very important to you as well.
Yeah, so let me start from that and then I will share my view. I think HP is a company of engineers. And what this means is that when we have a problem, we define a numeric goal, and then we have the path to address that problem. What are the actions that we need to take next month, and what improvements do we expect to see in a month, in 3 months, in a year? And we are applying to diversity our engineering methodology. So we have defined long-term goals, and then from these long-term goals, we are reviewing the plans and the progress every quarter and every year. We are basically managing it as we manage any other goal, any other business goal that we have in the company. And we have defined, as you were saying, fairly aggressive goals. We have committed to double the number of Black and African American executives within the next 3 years now. We have also defined that by 2030, we want 50-50 gender parity in executive levels, which is a fairly difficult goal to achieve given the starting point that we have today. But our methodology is clear. Long-term goal divided by specific goals over time and measuring progress and making everybody accountable for that is a metric that every leader in the company has in his or her scorecard and that we track regularly. And then in terms of whether we see differences or conflicts between the different diverse groups, I think we need to have a common goal. I agree with Melody. It is not a zero-sum game. By having a more diverse company, a more diverse executive team, a more diverse engineering team, our company will perform better. We will understand better our customers. And this is really an incentive that we need to drive in everything we do. And at the same time, we know that this is going to be helping us from a business perspective because our customers more and more value the fact that we represent the right values in the society, that we have a goal of having a positive impact. And over time, this also translates into a positive, a big
Right.
business differentiator.
If I could just add on to that, which is,
yes, please.
I'm listening to Enrique. I just agree with you so much. One of my favorite lines is from McKinsey. They have a line that says, "Observe your obligation to dissent." And when I think about Silicon Valley, I think about businesses that were built on dissension and disruption, saying this is, some people ask why, some people ask why not. This is the why not group, right? And so they're always looking at things slightly differently and going up against whatever the norm is that exists at that time. What I find so interesting, that is the actual genius of diversity, that you're bringing together these dissenting voices, you're bringing together these different points of view. So it's ironic that in an industry or in an area that is created vast fortunes and created the biggest businesses in the world, by going up against a conventional view and being willing to argue a point, that the voices inside start to become more homogeneous by virtue of the backgrounds of the people. So it undermines the whole thesis of what the industry was built on. And so inviting those differing voices, the data is so clear that, there's a book by Scott Page called The Difference, a mathematical and economics professor at the University of Michigan, who's made it clear that if you're trying to solve a hard problem, that the best way to do so is with diverse voices, even diverse intellect. And I'll end by this one point that I say all over and over again. The interesting thing about, again, if we just go back to math and probability and statistics, genius and talent are equally distributed in our society across gender and across ethnicity. That is a fact. The weird thing is that if you go into tall buildings in our society, as you go up those buildings, they become whiter and maler, suggesting that there is more genius and talent there. It's just actually not true. And so that means people are being left out that can make that organization a better organization, but you actually have to believe that, which I know to be true. I don't have to be convinced.
It speaks to be able to see your representation in positions of power like this.
We need to represent everyone's story. I remember when Meg Whitman, Whitman College was built in Princeton. I was on the board of Princeton at the time, and she was the first woman to have a college named after her on a campus that at that point was almost 300 years old. So Hobson College, which is not yet built, but will be built in 2026, that second woman, first Black person, says a lot about where we are in society, which is we have an epically long way to go.
Well, we talk about metrics. We talk about a great example of a Silicon Valley company leading the way, to your points, Melody, with you and HP Inc., Enrique. I'm very curious, when you shut the doors, all the press people aren't saying all the right things. What are those impediments that are preventing us from getting to, not HP, but your peers? If we talk about it openly here, why aren't we able to accelerate this change at the pace this moment requires?
I think because even if for us that is a really important objective and where we put a lot of energy, it is hard to change. It is hard to change how people has been hiding for many, many years. It is hard to change those processes. There is a lot of unconscious bias at all levels of the organization. There are no references that young people see and think, oh, this is what I want to do. And then many people is left through the process. So accomplishing that change, which is really a systemic change across many layers of the company, many layers of the society, is much harder than what it seems. And it's not that there are bad intentions, or in many cases people don't take it seriously. Change is hard and requires a lot of energy, a lot of commitment, a lot of passion. And it also, we need to acknowledge, it takes time. As a CEO, I would like always to, when we make a decision, we would like this to happen the next day. But unfortunately, making progress takes time and takes perseverance. And I think this is what we need to put in place now and make sure that we stay focused and we drive this change over time.
And you mentioned your employees, Enrique, and that your workforce is trying to drive this change and wants to see this change. Is that saying that in your experience, 30 plus years there working your way up at HP, you have not seen that type of drive from the workforce for change? Clearly, we had George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. It's, the list goes on, unfortunately, where we've seen horrible instances of racism and violence. Has that catalyzed something that's different now in your employees, or are executives recognizing it in a different way than they previously have?
I think it definitely had an impact and has created significant change. I think the murder of George Floyd made all of us aware of the situation that many of our colleagues were going through. When it happened, we organized a series of town halls when we had Black employees sharing their own experiences, sharing their own lives. And we did that on Zoom because we were all working from home at that point. But you could see people crying, not only because of the stories that were being shared, but also because many of us realized that these things were happening around us and we were not seeing them. And we were really feeling bad, not only because of the story, but because we had not realized and had not taken action before. So I think many of us went through a set of very different feelings through the process. Really, we were very upset by what we were learning. We were then discouraged because many of us thought we had done a lot of the right things to make progress, and we realized that we were really falling short in accomplishing and driving the change that we needed to drive. And then once we went through this, we realized that we really needed to use this as an opportunity to accelerate change, to drive more change internally, to also use the strength that we have as a company to drive change externally. Because I always say our company is both a community, and we need to make sure that within our community we behave according to what we think we want to accomplish, but we are also a very strong platform that can be used to drive change externally. We can influence our suppliers, we can influence our partners, we can influence the communities where we are present, and we need to use that strength to accelerate the change that we all realize is absolutely needed.
That's very well put. And if it's beyond community, it's also legislation. The legislation that mandated racial diversity on corporate boards in California. I know Enrique, HP was the first company that jumped out behind that. Silicon Valley Leadership Group came out and endorsed that as well. And that's creating a real, I think, positive impact, although it's yet to be fully felt and realized. But Melody, I want to ask you that same question. Our mutual friend, Ken Coleman, he talks about and he's an HP alum as well, Enrique, a legend here in the Valley, talks about the perishability of this moment. I always told him I'd use that line. How can we ensure that, we're coming out of COVID, we're running around with kids, life's getting back to normal. How can we ensure that 5 years from now, when I sit and talk with you and Enrique, we're not having the same conversation about needing to do much, much more to diversify Silicon Valley?
Well, it is perishing in real time. And that is something that's worrying me, that it becomes a moment as opposed to a movement. And I think that's a very different thing. And so we need to get out of the moment space and into something that is more protracted and institutionalized. And the only way to institutionalize things is to institutionalize policies. What I worry about is that charismatic leader like Enrique, who carries this flag. I always tell people diversity and equity and inclusion is everyone's problems in the organization. It is something it's not something where edicts come from on high. It's everyone doing their part. I get challenged when I say that all the time. I have people at the early stages of their career who tell me they have no power. And I just remind them, Rosa Parks just decided not to stand up. She had no power that was identifiable at that point. She was on a bus and didn't get up when she was told to yield her seat, and she helped change the course of history. So I think what corporations need to understand is the institutionalization of this, just as we institutionalize everything from, how we think about Sarbanes-Oxley to how we think about all sorts of things that we do. We institutionalize them. So we create processes around them that hold us accountable. We call them at the Black Corporate Directors Conference, where we bring together all of the Fortune 500 Black directors, including those who sit on boards in the Valley. We talk about the 3 Ps: people, purchasing, and philanthropy. You already did my quote, math has no opinion. We think it matters, it counts. So you show the math. And the math is to count around the people from the top of the organization to the rank and file across ethnicity, as I mentioned. On purchasing, we talk about business diversity, not procurement, because you don't procure investment managers, you don't procure investment bankers, you don't procure lawyers. The 21st century economy that we have, 2/3 of GDP is service related. And procurement often isn't looking at those service contributions, those tier 1 suppliers to the company. They're thinking about widgets that are bought or logistics and things like that. So we want to look at the corporate spend across every category and measure the diverse spend. And if it's not there, have a rationale for it. So we get it. There are no Black or brown companies that make semiconductor chips. That's going to be a 0 in that area. But in marketing, in financial services, and all these other areas, where do you stand up in terms of where you spend your money, which ultimately creates a virtuous circle of prosperity for all of society? And the last one is philanthropy. There, I think the tail is wagging the dog. People are very, very comfortable leading with telling you the donations that they're making. But diversity is not about charity. Diversity is not philanthropy. Diversity is about fixing your own house from within, not without. And charity is great. I'm glad that a lot of civil rights organizations have been helped in the wake of George Floyd. I have told some of my friends who run those organizations, don't even take the donation if it's not going to be multi-year. No hit and runs. It'd be better just to not build up around that and then have to deconstruct it later because you can't sustain the effort. But more importantly, for corporations to understand that is nice, but it doesn't absolve you from the bigger issues that exist in terms of true inclusion inside of your own organization.
Well, the point first of all, incredible perspective, Melody. And there's so much that we could double click on there, although our time is beginning to run short. But Enrique, the point about purchasing, the economics that Melody makes, I think is particularly impactful. which I know has been a focus for you at HP around supply chain, et cetera. And also the bigger purpose, you look at a Fortune 50, Fortune 100 company and HP 50 billion plus in revenue, what it means for you to step out in a big way around DEI. And I'd love to just give you a platform here for a couple minutes to share that, to speak about purchasing power, to speak about how HP is stepping out and where you think that can drive change beyond Silicon Valley. Because we say at SVLG that we're trying to drive change in Silicon Valley, change the face of leadership here, that reverberates across corporate America, given the leadership role Silicon Valley has, frankly, in the world.
I think the good thing of Silicon Valley is that many of us are global companies. So if we can have a global impact, which is really what is necessary. But let me give you a few examples. And again, this is with this philosophy that we as a company are a platform, and as a platform, we can multiply the change because we really can influence what many other companies are doing. But for example, a few years ago, we already determined that for any marketing organization to sell their services to us, they need to meet certain criteria in terms of diversity in the teams that we are dealing with. And we have expanded that to other groups because we saw the impact this was having. And by driving those metrics, going back to if you have a goal, you can drive the change, we impose those metrics on our suppliers across the board, and this is clearly paying off and having an impact. We're also redirecting our purchase activities to companies that have already diversity, companies that were founded by Black or African American people that we can really help to grow and to have an impact in the communities where they are. That's another very important driver that we use. And again, with all this, what we really have is the opportunity of having a significant impact, not only in our companies, but in the companies that are doing business with us.
Well, thank you, Enrique. And maybe to pivot to a final thought here, and I would make it twofold. Melody, first, I would ask, we've got a platform here, many CEOs in the audience, many of our board members that are listening here today. I would ask, what is your message to the leaders in Silicon Valley who are serious about driving change related to DEI to see this through and make it happen? That's one. And then let's not think about the CEOs, but think about those young interns like Enrique many years ago who also listen to our programming and are thinking about how they can one day find themselves in a position of leadership like all of us to drive change. I would love that, maybe the dual purpose advice, speaking to the CEOs and speaking to the young people in the audience, to share your perspective and final thoughts.
Well, first of all, Enrique was not the only intern. I was an intern at Ariel as well between my sophomore and junior years in college. And I have had one job since I graduated from college. Out of my class of 1,100 people at Princeton, I'm the only person who's had the same work phone number since I graduated in 1991. So
that's a good and a bad thing, Melody, right? People can find you.
That's that. I like that. But what I would say about my advice to, first of all, the leaders, I told this story and I hope that it'll translate in this situation. When I was growing up, my mother, I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and my mother would always tell me, Melody, you could be or do anything. At the same time, she always let me know what I was up against. She never held back on the discrimination I would face, the challenges I would have, but she said, there's no excuse. You can overcome those. Enrique clearly had a tremendous career and has a tremendous career. I have had the same thing, but we are unicorns. Now, this is something that people understand in Silicon Valley as unicorns. And we might think unicorns happen all day long, but they don't. We are not indicative of the broader society and ethnic groups that we come from. And so the question is not to set your mind to, well, Melody made it and Enrico made it, and they pulled themselves up. And so therefore, anyone can do it. Miracles had to happen. The universe had to bend our way. So much had to conspire to create the opportunities that exist for us to be here, that you can't, again, if you go back to institutionalization or scaling them, you can't scale that change with the circumstances that got us here. So that's one piece. The second piece that I would say is back to my mother's story about you can be or do anything. I have an 8-year-old child, and I told my 8-year-old child, Everest, you can be or do anything. but I want you to believe that is true of anyone and everyone. I want you to look out into the world and believe anyone can be or do anything. That there is no correlation to their age, no correlation to their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, or their income, their economic prosperity or lack thereof. And if we take that point of view in looking at the world, I think it completely changes the picture in terms of what is possible. But you actually have to believe it. You have to come at the perspective of looking at people and thinking anything is possible for them. In Silicon Valley, I do believe that sometimes there's this righteous belief in meritocracy, that everyone here is really smart and everyone here is best in breed. I always give the story back again, one last point. If you go to Princeton and you are the child of someone who graduated from Princeton, you have a higher likelihood of getting in. That is not a true meritocracy. So people who are legacies have a better shot. No, that is one of the best universities in the world, and the Ivies see the world that way. So to believe that that is a true meritocracy, even at that institution of greatness, can be challenged. And so there is actually, when you think about true meritocracies, I have failed to find a true meritocracy because people get this thumb put on the scale for them for one reason or another that can change outcomes. So when you look at Enrique, and me, and you see this outcome, don't think, well, it's possible because it was possible for them. A lot had to happen. And we're just trying to increase the odds where more people can be like us and not held back because of systems.
Melody, you are most certainly a unicorn in every way, and that's a very powerful close. And Enrique, the advice to your CEO peers, and then to Melody's point, to the young people in the audience looking to become, hopefully they aren't unicorns at that point, and there's much more in terms of representation at the top in 20, 30 years, but would love to hear your closing thoughts.
Sure. I think to the CEOs, I think the key message needs to be that diversity is not something that should be owned by the chief people officer or by the chief diversity officer. We need to own it, and we need to believe that this is something that is going to help our companies to do better. Because if we own it and we drive it, the change will happen. And I love what Melody said before. We need to make sure that the moment that we have gone through during the last years becomes a movement. And if we all believe on that, I think it will happen. And then to the young employee, I will complement with what Melody was saying, because I really agree that the message that anything is possible is the one that we need to drive them, is also to make sure that they always challenge the status quo, that they have now an opportunity of driving change because certain things are happening in a certain way is not definitely the right thing. And they need to drive this. They need to challenge how things are done, because if they do, they clearly have the opportunity of accelerating the change.
This has been incredible. Enrique, Melody, thank you. And Melody, I got those days of 2026 or 27. I got to get to Princeton when we have that unveiling. And Enrique, what you're doing around HP and driving this change in Silicon Valley, we're all grateful for. We have heard the call, right? A movement, not a moment. Thank you both. Incredible conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Grijalva, and I'm Senior Associate of the Racial Justice and Equity Team for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. At SVLG, we believe that community and nonprofit groups play an essential role in our society, and without them, today's conversation on equity and innovation doesn't happen. So today, during our Innovating Equity Summit, you'll hear from a number of leaders who are at the forefront when it comes to taking action, all with the goal of bringing positive change to our city and communities in our Equity SV feature. Equity SV is about recognizing some of the important diverse voices of our community. It's also about making sure that programs and policies reflect the true needs of the population that they serve. We asked each of these groups what an inclusive Silicon Valley looks like from their point of view. Take a listen.
Hi, I'm Angelica Cortez, and I'm the founder and executive director of Lead Filipino, a nonprofit organization based out of San Jose that focuses on increasing the civic participation and grassroots leadership of Filipina X and O American communities and larger communities that are supportive of our mission. We work year-round in spaces that build the leadership and confidence of Phil-Ams and larger Asian American Pacific Islander communities. And what an inclusive Silicon Valley looks like to us is largely two parts. One, centering our stories, our historic contributions and experiences in mainstream public education. And we connect that to confidence building, self-efficacy, and positive self-concept as we develop our leaders in our communities and our neighborhoods. And two, we educate our communities, our students, our youth, our seniors around real estate, property ownership, building and growing your businesses to pass them down to your family members, and investments. So really integrating financial literacy for all communities. So that's what it looks like to us. I want to thank the team at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group for inviting us to participate.
Blue Shield of California is proud to be a thought leader sponsor of the Innovating Equity Summit. At Blue Shield of California, a diverse workforce with real equity for employees isn't just a key value, it makes up who we are, literally. 40% of those who sit on our board of directors are people of color. More than 50% of those who sit on our board of directors are women, including the chair. More than 50% of our executives are women. It's just part of the reasons why we've been recognized with more than a dozen representation and hiring awards in the past year, including as a leading disability employer, as a best company for women to advance, and as a best place to work for LGBTQ. When it comes to our very talented workforce, we have no pay gap between men and women. We have no pay gap between racial and ethnic groups in comparable jobs, and we have a deep commitment to maintaining that standard. But it's not enough to just demonstrate our values in our company. We have to carry that message everywhere we go. And we do. We provide funding to nonprofit groups who are trusted within communities of color to advance equity and have been expanding Blue Sky, our signature program that funds youth mental health services, to reach more young people of color. But Blue Shield of California's most active recent role has been in supporting health equity through equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. As the third-party administrator of California's COVID-19 vaccine campaign, we've helped to ensure that vaccines are distributed equitably, efficiently, and as quickly as possible to reach every corner of our state, with a special focus on regions hardest hit by this public health crisis, which include communities of color. We cannot simply be a voice for unity, we must be a force for action. As a non-profit health plan, Blue Shield of California is uniquely positioned to address the root causes of health inequity and drive meaningful and sustained change. This is how we remain true to our North Star of creating a healthcare system that is worthy of our family and friends and sustainably affordable for all Californians. This is why Blue Shield of California is proud to present today's Inclusive Conversation series, a diverse set of dialogues. These are some of the people doing the hard work of creating the practices and policy to drive greater equity in our companies and our communities. First up is an energetic dialogue on hiring and workforce. Sonia Wilkerson is Executive Vice President and Chief People Officer at Bloom Energy. She sits down with SVLG's VP of Member Success, Lisa Gauchier. Enjoy.
Hello, Sonia. It is so good to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Lisa. It's so great to reconnect.
It is. You know, I would remind anybody before we get into our discussion, first of all, it's very difficult to go behind those three major hitters ahead of us, but we're going to make this happen. Also, in the Silicon Valley, we have to be mindful of, you never know who you're going to meet or see again when you work. You and I worked together at a company early on in my career, and I appreciate your leadership and your support then.
Thank you, Lisa. It's so wonderful to see you changing Silicon Valley.
Thank you.
Really delightful to watch.
Thank you. Yeah, we're here to talk about, the chief people and diversity officer roles. We're here because we know that there is a need to implement diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only in our work, but in our organizations. We have seen a rise in hires with chief titles recently. However, this role and its coverage may vary. Would you mind sharing a bit about your background and Bloom's approach to this role? What do you do? What do you cover? And how do you approach your work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll start by sharing my just a very high level of my background. I've been in Silicon Valley and working in high tech and in HR for, hate to admit this, but almost 30 years now. And watching this valley evolve. And by the way, this whole diversity conversation isn't new. So I like to remind people of that. Like, we were having this conversation like 30 years ago. I'm very proud of the fact that it's becoming more prominent. Now I'd like to focus on Bloom Energy and who we are, because I do believe that we have a culture that actually embraces inclusiveness, and I lead with inclusive, as well as diversity in a way that we are so proud of. And in my role as Chief People Officer, I have an opportunity to influence how diversity is led within the organization, how the culture is shaped, and working with our CEO, K.R. Sridhar, who's absolutely a phenomenal CEO, and he personally leads with diversity. So since Dr. Sridhar, frankly, personally believes in diversity and has led by example, if you look at our senior leadership team, it's a very diverse. I think he has one of the most diverse groups in the company, which is kind of amazing to start at the top. So I had an opportunity to influence that, as well as an opportunity to continue to keep diversity top of mind for leaders as they're hiring, growing, promoting, and developing talent within the organization, and making it part of our DNA rather than an event.
No, that is good to hear. And again, Bloom is very fortunate to have you in that leadership role, helping him through this process. Change is hard. It can be particularly challenging when it comes to influencing hearts and minds and reframing how people fundamentally operate. We also know that sometimes good intentions go awry and fits and starts are part of the process, which can often lead to frustration for DEI professionals. Could you share with us how you approach overcoming obstacles and building allyship for your efforts internally? Any lessons or notes of wisdom that you'd like to impart on the audience?
Yeah, I tell you, we do this daily, right? And when I talk about diversity not being an event, that certainly makes the role of DE&I much, I won't say simple, because it's not a simple role. This is a very, very difficult and frustrating role, because you feel like you move the needle a little bit and then you slide backwards. So it's always evolving. Within Bloom, we have made the whole conversation around diversity just a part of who we are. So again, I emphasize that it's not an event. When I work with my senior leadership team and influence and work towards influencing them and keeping diversity top of mind, that's part of being the pride of this role, is having that ability to influence and keeping that conversation on the forefront. Diversity leaders, look, we've all rolled out diversity programs that have some been a success and some have been received lukewarm, and that is always disappointing. And when I work with D&I leaders, specifically, who are just dedicated and that's their full-time job, You know, folks in this role just have to be persistent as well as pragmatic, because it's a journey. You know, you really do make progress. Yes, we wanted to move faster. We wanted to be a revolution and not an evolution, but the reality of change is it evolves, and it never evolves at the pace that we want it to. But as long as we continue to keep that intense, dedicated focus on, and by the way, diversity means a lot of things: diversity of thought, diversity of culture, multiple cultures, you know, women. So diversity is just, it's a complex topic in itself. And my goal is never to put leaders in a position where they feel forced to do something, because that never works. I find that you move minds and hearts by winning the leaders who want to come along with you and engaging them to help influence their colleagues as well, because you can't do it alone. So you have to invite a lot of people in, as many people in, leaders in, and you have to just continue to keep that intense focus.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you for that insight. You know, and one of the other questions is how, you know, it is often quoted that what is measured gets addressed. However, this statement is sometimes challenging when it comes to DEI, because the data are not always readily available. Metrics and methodologies are emerging. Tell us a bit about how you think about measuring success, and what, from your view, needs to be done on a larger scale to make sure we're able to track progress and meet goals. Are there any programs or policies you think are best practices or are most helpful?
Yeah, it's interesting because this topic of diversity is now, and actually, frankly, is fortunate because it drives accountabilities within companies, that the conversations have gone not only to the boardroom level, which is absolutely critical and certainly has influence on the senior leadership team. It's also, you know, becoming part of the external measures as far as success of a company in the financial communities. So it's amazing how that forces and shifts mindset. And I hate to say force, but sometimes that's what it takes to drive this kind of change. I think for, you know, in order to move this, I'm not a big fan of, obviously, I would never set a quota. Quotas don't work. Quotas just are met with resistance and frankly has an adverse impact. What you can do, what we do within our organization, is build a robust pipeline, ensure that we have a qualified pipeline of diverse talent. And frankly, you know, I will oftentimes review a pipeline and say, hey, what's happening here? And there are companies, you have that pipeline, you have to have a diverse person in the pipeline, and it becomes kind of a game that happens. I don't want that to happen at Bloom, and I don't believe it happens at Bloom, frankly, because I see my numbers beginning to increase. I think the key to this whole conversation is creating a culture and environment that is inclusive, that attracts talent in. You have to, you want to invite in diverse talent, well, you got to have people to kind of look like you at the top, right? So that people feel like, wow, I can be successful here. Look, there's somebody who represents me in my culture. That becomes a part of the formula. So establishing metrics, our metrics in Bloom, we don't have specific metrics per se, but we do keep our intense focus on, I know my numbers, I know my stats, and you know, I like to see those continue to move forward. We also gauge from, you know, from an employee engagement perspective, turnover is another factor. You can get them in, if you can't keep them, that's another problem, right? There may be something indicative happening in your culture in which people are like, I don't want to stay. What's happening in promotions? What are your percentage of promotions that are happening within your culture as well? So there are many different metrics that you can put in place to monitor. Enforcement is a different conversation, but I think every diversity leader and chief people officer should know their numbers, and they should be aware from a analytic perspective, what's happening with their environment, and be able to tell that story to their senior leadership team to influence this conversation of diversity and influence the executives to keep a pulse on the culture.
No, I appreciate that. And when you think about that, I think about the word that's left out oftentimes is belonging, because there are oftentimes we can have these DEI programs and you can bring somebody in the front door. If we're not supporting them on the back end, they're going out the back door. Do you have any thoughts on where belonging fits in all of this conversation?
Yeah, and it's interesting because people have asked me that, and frankly, I think we kind of use belonging and inclusiveness, although the definitions are different, kind of in the same way at Bloom. Because when people can, we say we bring our full selves to work. Well, of course you have to bring your full self to work. Like, what else? We don't expect anything different. So, we embrace those differences. We appreciate the thought leadership. We appreciate the diversity of thought. And that creates a sense of belonging within our culture that, frankly, we're very proud of.
Right. Sonia, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your partnership with the leadership group, and we hope that you will continue to work with us. We look forward to the day when we are not talking about DE&I because the work is done and we see the change. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Lisa. You as well.
Hello, my name is Jamal Williams, and I currently am the co-chair of the Black Leadership Kitchen Cabinet of Silicon Valley. We stand as an organization that serves to fight for, advocate, and work on behalf of the Black community in the Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley region. We want to be a space for all Black community members and Black organizations, all fighting alongside each other for our equity and liberation. Some of the big wins and successes of the Black Leadership Kitchen Cabinet over the years include bringing the Roots Clinic, which is a Black-owned, Black-run health clinic, to San Jose. The Roots Community Health Center was instrumental in providing testing and vaccinations to thousands of residents throughout the San Jose and Santa Clara County area, and has been instrumental in taking care of and serving the Black community for years. A more inclusive Silicon Valley to me is one that starts with bold, transformational solutions. And these are solutions and strategies that we have never seen before in this area. It looks like solutions that start with income distribution and wealth distribution done completely differently. We know that we have a huge problem with homelessness in this area. And I think transformation looks like all of our institutions in Silicon Valley using their resources to make sure every person is housed. We know that we have wage gaps and income and earning gaps that run across racial lines and additional disparities. We need bold solutions that help help work with organizations like mine. And I invite all of you to be a part of this work. In about a month, we're going to relaunch our new blkc.org website. It's going to serve as a hub for Black community organizations and Black residents. There will also be a space there where all of you can donate and support our Black institutions in this area. We need everybody to put in their efforts to be a part of the change and a part of the bold strategic transformation that I know we can get to.
Coming up next at the Innovating Equity Summit, an important panel, Increasing Boardroom Diversity.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cheryl Hilliard-Tucker, and I'm the Executive Director of the Board Challenge. And the Board Challenge is a movement to add more Black directors to American corporate boards. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So thank you to the Silicon Valley Leadership Group for inviting me and the two panelists to have this critical conversation. Over the past 18 months, the board diversity movement has generated unprecedented traction as lawmakers and regulators and business leaders and racial and social justice advocates focus on making the US companies more transparent and accountable. So legislation in California and other states, as well as the groundbreaking NASDAQ ruling, has upped the urgency of board diversity, with laws and regulations and deadlines and consequences for not complying. And at the same time, many CEOs are starting to recognize the overwhelming evidence demonstrating that unique director perspectives will drive company performance and ensure they live their DEI standards. But still, many CEOs feel they don't have a strategy or a network to diversify their boards. So in this session, Silicon Valley insiders and co-founders of the Board Challenge, Sukhinder Singh Cassidy and Guy Primus, will address these concerns. So let's start with Sukhinder. Why don't you introduce yourself and provide some insights on a question that really is very hot topic. What's the biggest challenge of making board diversity a universal reality? And why is this such a difficult conversation?
Well, thank you for having me, Cheryl. It's great to be here. So I'm Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, and besides being a co-founder of the Board Challenge, I am the founder and chairman of the Board List, which is a platform that makes it easy to discover and recommend and search for diverse executives and leaders for your board. And when I think about kind of what is the biggest challenge that remains to making a universal reality, I'd say there are two. Number one, on the public side, continues to be board terms. The idea that, in order for there to be room for your boardroom to modernize and to acquire the diverse sets of skills and experiences that are needed to meet tomorrow's challenge, you need to have healthy board turnover. And the person who's on your board today may not be the most appropriate person for your next challenge. That is probably one of the larger challenges on the public side. On the private side, I think it continues to be access, meaning, the myth that there are not enough qualified directors continues to be a challenging one. And I would note that on both public, and by the way, that is a myth, platforms like Valence and the Board List and others make it quite easy today to find very qualified, superb leaders that have many diverse characteristics. But I think the most important thing is across public and private, the one thing to note is if you're not willing to expand your criteria to those people who can do the job versus the traditional criteria, you will suffer from this myth that there are not enough great folks. And what we all know is many more people are qualified to join the boardroom than the historic criteria that you have to be the CEO of a Fortune 100 or 500 company would suggest.
Yeah, we're going to really delve into that. But before we do, Guy, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you think?
Okay, great. Well, Cheryl, it's always good to see you, and Sukhinder, good to reconnect. It's been a minute. So thanks for having me, you guys. My name is Guy Primus. I'm the CEO of a company called Valence, and our mission is to create new paths to success for Black professionals, obviously all the way up to the boardroom and beyond, right? So we want to have Black leaders that have cultural impact, but especially in the boardroom and at the highest levels of corporate America. I also sit on the board of a company called the Virtual Reality Company, which I founded 7 years ago. I also am chairman of the Strategic Planning Committee at Southern California Public Radio, which was the home of A. Martinez before he was kind of pilfered by NPR for Morning Edition, and also serve as an advisor to a number of companies and other organizations, including Comic Relief US, Blacksmith, which is a artist management and record label at Motown, and most importantly for me right now, a company called Hapdex, which is a haptic feedback glove provider that is in, hopefully they're able to avoid litigation with a very, very large FANG company that we all know and love. So that's my background. I'm also a two-time inventor and, really proud and leader of the Board Challenge with Sukhinder and Brad Gershner, who is not here today. So let me give you my opinion on all this. I think a lot of this is difficult because it's new. It's also uncomfortable, right? So a lot of CEOs, non-gov committees don't have the connections to, these aspiring Black board members and Latinx board members and AAPI board members, women board members. They don't have those natural networks. And so not only are they not familiar, but it's uncomfortable to say that they don't know. So that's my kind of fundamental premise and my belief. And I think we, as Sukhinder said, there are a lot of ways around that. So we look forward to discussing those today.
Sukhinder, you also have some deep roots there in Silicon Valley. You want to tell us a little bit more about some of those?
Sure. Happy to. So most recently, I was the president of StubHub, which I ran before we sold it, right before the pandemic, for a little over $4 billion. my prior career, I've started 3 companies in the Valley: Yodely, the Board List, obviously, which we're talking about today, and a company called Joyous. And I spent the early part of my career as a leading executive at Google as it was building its international business. And I sit on the board of several companies you might know. I'm the lead independent at Upstart, which is a fintech company. Was a board member at TripAdvisor as it went public, Ericsson, and Stitch Fix, which is one of the leaders when it comes to board diversity, actually, and really proud of the progress that team has made, as well as several private tech boards.
Yeah, no, that's important because, we're talking about something that is very sensitive, and having founders of a movement that actually understand what this is all about is very helpful as we talk to a lot of different CEOs in different industries. But before we start unpacking all the things that you've revealed, I want to just give a little bit of statistics on board diversity. So according to the 2021 Spencer Stewart report on S&P 500 boards, 30% of all directors in the S&P are women. 21% of all directors are from racially diverse backgrounds. 11% are Black directors, 5% are Latinx directors, and 5% are Asian American or Pacific Islanders. So Guy and Sukhinder, hearing these numbers and thinking about what I talked about earlier with the California legislation and legislation in other states, as well as the NASDAQ ruling, do you think that regulation and legislation are the most effective way to increase board diversity? And if not, what else is needed? And if yes, how do we enforce the regulation and legislation to make this reality and to make this make a real difference?
So I think from my perspective, many years ago, people would ask me if I was a fan of quotas, and I would actually say no. I would say, I think they're not needed. Companies are going to do the right thing. And what we saw even before California and sort of the coming on board of, let's call it, institutional shareholders and advisory firms like NASDAQ or Goldman, is that Europe actually led the way, right? And then we had other markets, including the UK and Canada, where they have more of a say or explain kind of policy, but at least the data reporting needs to come to light. And not only that, you need to, identify if you can't meet these ratios, why not? And so my feelings have really changed. I do think that, legislation does play an effective role in moving forward what should otherwise be an obvious business case. And I'm kind of much more supportive of it today than, let's say, I was several years ago, because I've seen the effects. And quite frankly, I always say to people, while we wish, people would always do the right thing, it's simply not the case that happens. So my belief set is it is an effective policy. Now, to your point, how do you make it a reality? Well, first and foremost, I mean, legislation clearly, has repercussions for non-enforcement. But I think one short of that, when people are forced to sort of explain kind of non-compliance, even, offer reporting and identify why they haven't done it, that level is like quite, a little short of enforcement, but it does provide the catalyst for people to really go build pipelines and be clear and kind of, I would say, wider in their criteria. So I think it's a step short, but it is somewhat effective as well.
Great. I'll jump in and say I agree with Sukhinder. I'm too have not been a big fan of quotas historically, but I think that when I look at really where we need to be, it looks like the courts and legislation and just movements like NASDAQ are. So I went to Georgia Tech, which was the first Southern university to integrate peacefully. The rest of the industries and universities around us had challenges. They either had to have court legislate or court ordered, kind of integration, or there was melees, right? Blood in the streets. And obviously that's not what we're talking about, but I think that is something that we can learn from, that is the quickest way to get to where we need to be, which is kind of full integration representation on boards. The other thing I would really kind of look to point at is that that's a short-term solution, right? Putting people on boards starts to illuminate the path to others who are coming behind, but there needs to be a pipeline, and we need to start working on that now. We need to start talking to kids in high school what it means to serve on a board, and in college what it means to serve on a board, so that in 20 and 30 years, we're not having the same conversation. So, I think there is a two-pronged solution. One is immediate, and yes, everything that you talked about is helpful, and it's probably the best way to go forward. But ultimately, we need to build that pipeline and that pathway to greater board service by everyone in society.
Yeah, I know both of you are really Silicon Valley community people. You know this world. I'm curious about what's really going on over there in tech and some of the other companies there. But first, I wanted to share some statistics. Spencer Stewart study released some information revealing that Tech 200 boards are way below the S&P 500 boards when it comes to diversity numbers. No surprise there, I can see it on your face. Only 3% of the directors are Black, 1.5 are Latinx, and 10% are Asian American or Pacific Islanders. And the good news, though, is that 96% of these boards have at least one woman director. So, Sukhinder, what are you thinking?
Well, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. First of all, as we talked about, as a company gets closer to going public, it pays more attention to these issues for obvious reasons. We know that there's a lot more scrutiny. So I think that companies start later than they should. And so I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing kind of this dichotomy in the numbers, particularly if so that's one piece here, is that they're still private and they don't really take it seriously sometimes until they're ready to go public. Number two, and I think you hit this, intersectionality is a much more recent issue, and ethnic diversity or, racial diversity as well. I think one would argue that the first time boards thought about diversity at all, it was with regard to gender only, not gender and race, or gender or race, i.e., you ought to have both, and you shouldn't be trying to solve everything with like a single arrow. I mean, that's ridiculous. You should have a boardroom that has, representation. The one other thing I think that's important to note with tech companies, as you probably know, is there's also migration of availability. I come back to this notion of availability, of how seriously a tech board takes an independent director seat. And I think we find that not often enough do early stage founders take advantage of an available empty seat for an independent, which is one of the great places to add diversity of all kinds, experience, industry, ethnicity, gender, just diverse thinking to that room. So I think this is why you're seeing this reflection, that if they tackled it at all, it was first and foremost with regard to gender, but they tackle it later, and there's a missed opportunity for sure.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised. Oh, go ahead, Guy.
Oh no, I just want to tack onto what Sukhinder is saying, because there's a myth like there are not enough Black and Latinx and API women board directors. There's also a myth of the kind of pipeline of that talent going into those companies, right? And so again, not to highlight Georgia Tech and everything that I say, but the largest engineering school, we produce more women and Black engineers in any school, and so it's really important to understand that that pipeline myth can be solved, and you just have to get beyond kind of the four walls of your company and even the friendly confines of Silicon Valley.
Well, you're the first one to come up and say it's not not a pipeline myth, it's a perception challenge, and that's something that's really important. And Sukhinder, when I jumped into the board challenge, it was very surprising to me how many CEOs, because that's what we spend a lot of time talking to CEOs, really didn't understand what they should be looking for their independent directors. They knew they were on the board, they had their investors on the board, who else do they need on the board? But I thought that one of the areas that we have concentrated on, and we're starting to see, is the investor community with Goldman Sachs and others, talking about the importance of their funding and making sure that the boards were diverse. The Carlyle Group also has made some efforts on that. Some of these, investors that are part of the board challenge community are doing that. So how can private equity investors and venture capital community really make a difference and impact driving board diversity on their portfolio companies?
I'll jump in. Go ahead, Sukhinder.
No, go ahead, Guy.
I think that the important thing for me is that the people at the top are paying attention to this. So, I've actually spoken with Kyu-Sung Lee from Carlyle Group about this, right? This is not something that is kind of bubbling up from inside the organization. These are top-down initiatives, and everyone knows that the company pays attention to what the CEO pays attention to. And so if it's not at the highest level, if it's not something that is a strategic priority for the leaders of private equity companies, of venture capital companies, it's not going to be paid attention to. And so fortunately, a lot more people are paying attention to, and we have some of our clients, kind of two of the largest VC firms in the world, kind of are engaged in these type of initiatives. And so I would just say that, yes, hopefully the CEOs are listening to as it comes bubbling kind of up, but it really takes them to say, this is a strategic priority. We are going to pay attention to this, and we are going to hold you as leaders and executives of the company accountable for the success in this area.
Sikenda?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add is we come back to that sort of independent seat. Often it goes unfilled, although it's in the term sheet of most VCs that the founder has the right to fill it. So I think what VC and private equity need to pay attention to is emphasizing the opportunity and importance of filling those seats early, obviously using their own networks of leaders to help fill those seats if they have them. And then 3, and I think that this is important, often one of the reasons there isn't, more independence in the boardroom is because, after several rounds of financing, so many board seats get filled with investors. So sometimes it requires investors to give up their seat if they have been on a board for 7 years, and you now have a board that has 1 independent and 7 investors. You have to ask, is that actually the characteristics you need for the company going forward? So in some cases, it requires them to emphasize early on using the seat, and later on, often, thinking about, is it time to rebalance the boardroom, including, do they all need to be in it?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Well, one of the things that a lot of CEOs believe that maybe for some of the larger companies, once they do get public, is that they need to pack their boards with other CEOs. Mm-hmm. And that there are not very many CEOs who are, at least in the S&P 500 level companies, but that who are Black or who are Asian, who are Latinx or women. And so you start thinking, well, if I can't get, if I need CEOs and there's no one there, then maybe I don't have to worry about this. But, last year was a very interesting year because of the number of new candidates that were selected for the S&P 500, 47% of the new directors came from racially diverse backgrounds. And that's double the number of 2020. So we know they're out there. This tells you a lot about the pipeline. So let's look at some of, you are both on boards. What are some of the credentials that you believe these boards need, that they're not really looking wide and far for enhancing their board abilities?
Well, I would identify both from my own experience, because I chair NomGov and have at several public companies, including Urban Outfitters. I would say both based on my own experience and then the demand we see on the board list, because we have, hundreds of boards that come to us every year looking for new board members. My observation is that once people detach on the myth that they need a CEO, what they're really looking for is thought leaders functionally and by domain. And some of the most popular searches tend to be chief marketing officers, chief revenue officers, or GMs, of course, chief product and technology officers for obvious reasons. Every company in the world is being disrupted by technology. So somebody who is a digital native on the technology and product side, those are the more obvious ones. The ones that I think are worth noting and, I would hope to see on the rise more. I think we see some evidence that people are looking for people with regulatory or lobbying or government affairs background in a world that geopolitically is more, intertwined with business than ever. I think that, we may see the rise of the supply chain, chief supply chain officer into the boardroom if supply chain remains a strategic issue. It is at this moment. I think there may be some demand for ESG type understanding. And I would say one thing I don't see often that I would wish to see more of, if you think about the talent wars that are going on everywhere and the importance of culture, diversity, and inclusion, as boardroom topics, we ought to be seeing more CHROs, who ascend to the boardroom. But that also is pretty early in its evolution. So That's what I observe at the board list and among the boards I'm on.
You know, board diversity is now being discussed in the same vein as board effectiveness, you know, that it is part of making boards better, stronger, looking at things like term limits and looking at not recycling all of the same, you know, usual suspects. And Guy, you talk about that a lot, that, you know, we really need to pay attention to this next gen of board leaders. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to understand invariably every year, some CEO puts his or her foot, usually a him, right? His foot in his mouth. that you know, they make some kind of you know, statement about diversity, and they have it just shows a fundamental lack of understanding, right? And so again, I won't call out companies. I'm not sure who's on this call, but you know, we've seen them. And they've kind of, they all issue a mea culpa, and then they scramble to do something, buy a company, hire, you know, chief diversity officer. They do something generally performative to actually correct that. And I think if we really think about the browning of America, if we think about, again, the globalization, we think about our reliance on, you know, foreign powers for the goods and services that we consume here in the United States, it really makes sense to think about those individuals who have that experience. And a lot of time, they're kind of up and coming board members, right? And the benefit of that is not only do you avoid stepping in these huge potholes and craters and sinkholes, but you actually provide incredible amount of opportunity. And my favorite example is one that I witnessed firsthand when I walked into the boardroom of Starbucks, right? You know, so Starbucks, people would tell Howard Schultz that Black people would not buy a $5 cup of coffee, and he should not consider opening up, you know, Starbucks stores in Black neighborhoods, right? And I live in a Black neighborhood. One of the first urban coffee opportunity stores, which Howard collaborated with Magic Johnson on, is in Ladera Center here. Was one of the top performing stores in the entire Starbucks network, you know, for several years. And so when you think about that, and you think about Melody Hobson and Olden Lee from Pepsi being in that boardroom and helping to guide and shape the thinking after the urban coffee opportunities kind of issue is, and you know, kind of a partnership that expanded with Magic Johnson, it is the type of thinking that I think should be replicated, especially in consumer-driven companies. But generally, anyone that has a Black employee workforce or Latin employee workforce or AAPI, anyone who does work globally, think globally, right? And act locally. If you have seats on the board, as Sukhinder said, you can do what you want to with that board. If you can add members to the Supreme Court, you can add members to your board, right? So that's my thinking.
You know, it's interesting, you know, Sukhinder, I would put global experience is probably also one of the things that a lot of companies are starting to look for. So over the past year, just talking about the board challenge and the work that we're doing in here, we've gotten 80 companies to take a pledge to be part of the board diversity movement. And 25 of these companies have taken the pledge to elect a Black director on their board within the 12 months. And 15 of these companies have fulfilled their pledge for a total of 18 directors. And, you know, it's interesting when people talking about who's out there and who's not out there, was having a conversation with a CEO, and he was saying, well, if I could only get a rocket scientist. And I was like, you need a rocket scientist? One of our companies have signed on Dr. Alec Gallimore, who is the Dean of the University of Michigan's College of Engineering. He is a rocket scientist. And as what's interesting about Dean Gallimore, Sukhinder, you mentioned regulations and access to government clearance, and he has the highest level of government clearance. Now, when most people would look at him, they'd see a very, you know, distinguished gentleman, but they're not going to assume that that level of expertise and credential are in that package. So that's where you still have that, you know, that perception challenge. So, what ways do you think that people of color, business leaders, can start upping their game and upping their visibility in this world to make sure that they are being counted when these seats are being recruited?
Sure. Well, a few things. While I wish it was the case that there was one kind of place you could come and learn about all the board seats in the world, unfortunately, it's the opposite. Board search is so incredibly fragmented, which means that if you want to serve on a board, you really do need to kind of activate on multiple levers, and multiple levels. So first and foremost, people always say, and it's true, tell your network, particularly those people who are sitting on boards. Because they often have connectivity in a search that's never really listed anywhere, right? Nobody kind of posts their board search on LinkedIn. So that's piece one. Piece two, of course, there are platforms that have board demand coming in, whether it's, flagging yourself to the board challenge, whether it's posting your profile on the board list, whether it's working with Valence. I think you want to have, you want to be kind of discovered, if that makes sense. And so I think you do need to, make sure you've got kind of multiple kind of opportunities to be discovered. I think that is really important. And the third one, and it's so obvious, but it's really kind of worth noting, besides working your close-in network and kind of making sure that you're discovered, is there are opportunities for you with the search firms. If you can get connected through your network to people who might see, multiple sources of demand, and it's good to be known there. But the thing I want to highlight the most across all of these channels is understanding, and we're going to come into it, what your board superpower is. You're in a boardroom to add value, and you're in a boardroom because something you have to say, can be strategically of relevance and, influential and needed by specific boardrooms. So often people are on the hunt for a board, but I don't think they think maybe as deeply about which board and why. And you don't need to have a target company, but what types of boards is really important as you're seeking to be discovered. To say to people, I want to be on public or private, I think I have this to contribute or this to contribute. So I think you need to give people a framework, for the types of things where you think you could add, true kind of thought leadership.
Cheryl, I'm going to chime in here. I last year participated in the first cohort of a program called Black Corporate Board Readiness at Santa Clara University. And there were 28 of us in the first cohort, truly remarkable individuals. Honestly, I invited quite a few to participate with me. And one of them was recently appointed to Poshmark board, Ebony Beckwith from Salesforce. And so seeing that and a handful of others out of the cohort has been really remarkable. But what's even more impressive is to see the second and third cohorts, also a bit daunting because they're so impressive, right? And so I would suggest that if you do want to up your game, make sure that you understand, to Sukender's point, understand what your superpower is, but also understand what it really takes to be on the board, because you're going to be faced with that, if you do have the benefit of being interviewed, it's really important to understand what you're getting into as well. And so the Black Corporate Board Readiness Program, I think McKinsey has a program. There are several others, but I am very partial to the Santa Clara University one. And again, it's truly remarkable individuals. And they also have a women's corporate board readiness program as well. So that's what I would recommend, is understand exactly what it takes. Also an incredible networking opportunity.
Both of you have had a lot of conversations with CEOs. I mean, that's why you started the Board Challenge. It's really a conversation with CEOs. Tell me about some of those conversations quickly.
Sure. I mean, my conversations with CEOs, I would say in a more positive light, they're mostly about how. They're not really about why. So I would just say, one of the most positive things is when I get calls from CEOs now, it's still the classic, hey, who do you know? People are still trying to tap my personal network or the board list network. But it is not why. It is not debate. It's mostly like, hey, I'm on a mission to get this done. What resources, do you have, or who do you know that might be able to help me make it so? So I know it sounds very simplistic, but I find it quite positive that most of my conversations now are about the how.
Yeah, it's moving from awareness. I think there's been a lot of, events like this and work with our colleagues in the board diversity movement, getting the word out of why. NASDAQ did a wonderful job of presenting a lot of research data about the importance of board diversity and the impact on corporate performance. What are you hearing when you talk, Guy, about?
I would say it's a lot of the same as Sukhinder. Again, people understand the competitive advantage of diverse thinking on boards. So I think the why has been answered to a large degree. In a lot of cases, again, adding to what Sukhinder said, a lot of the cases when I talk to folks, it is really about re-educating them on the, not the why they should add a Black board member, but why they should consider something different than, again, a public company CFO or a public company CEO, because again, they make an assumption that that's what they need. And when you dig a little bit deeper, they're looking for something, again, a functional expertise that Sukhinder suggested. And even they haven't thought, but that's, I would say it's almost like no one gets fired for hiring the public company CEO, right? So that's easy, it's safe. But it may not be the best thing for your shareholders. And so that's a really important thing. I look, my mentor, Gary May, who was kind of introduced me to board service. He's now the chancellor at UC Davis. Incredible individual, one of the best mentors in the history of the country. I sincerely believe that. But if you look at kind of who's followed in his footsteps now, my friend Reggie DeRoche, whose brother is Pascal DeRoche, who's the CFO at AT&T, right? They're all kind of this mindset of kind of like, let's help usher in the next generation of board members. And I look behind them, Rahim Beyah, who's the Dean of Engineering at Georgia Tech. I know he's in pursuit of board opportunities, right? So is Charles Isbell, who's the head of the College of Computing, 2 Black guys, right? And I know that they're out there and they deserve these opportunities. And so when I'm having the conversation, I'm saying, hey, did you think about blank? And that's really where I really focus a lot of my time.
So as we wrap up here, do you have any, like, just a lightning round of a piece of advice? One quick, we have 2 minutes.
Call Sukhinder.
Well, that's nice of you to say. It's actually called the board list, because there you can get discovered by many boards. But I think as importantly, it's what I talked about. It's like, take the time to understand your superpower and like on what dimension are you a thought leader in any boardroom that you would seek to enter. And I think having that nailed is really important for all aspects of discovery.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I joke about calling Sukhinder, but the board list, Valence, ELC, dozens of organizations have curated lists and personal relationships with future board members. So that warm introduction that you're looking for, they can provide it.
So thank you, Sukhinder and Guy, and our Zoom audience for joining me on this important conversation. I know there's so much more to cover to make board diversity a reality for more companies here in Silicon Valley and across the country. So we're looking forward to working with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group in the future. And if you wanted to know anything more about the Board Challenge, please check out our website at theboardschallenge.org and send me a note, and I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. So enjoy the rest of the Innovating Equity Summit. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gabriela Chavez Lopez, and I'm the Executive Director of the Latina Coalition of Silicon Valley. The Latina Coalition of Silicon Valley develops and strengthens the power of Latinas to advance our collective success through sisterhood, leadership, and civic engagement. We do that through a variety of programs, including our flagship leadership program, ELLA, Engaged Latina Leadership Activist Program, that trains women 19 through 29 to engage in their community as well as develop their professional skills and to be able to engage in policy and advocacy. We also have programming throughout the year that seeks to develop and train and connect women to different leadership opportunities and even job opportunities that will help them advance in their leadership and influence. We have a cross-sector group of women that is multi-generational, that is committed to giving back to their communities and helping each other advance into leadership. We see a more inclusive Silicon Valley being one that is welcoming to everyone and one that celebrates the diversity and cultural richness of our region, one that also acknowledges and celebrates the contributions of so many that add to the prosperity of this region and that contributes so much to the economy. We cannot afford to leave so many people behind if we are going to enjoy continued growth and prosperity as a region. Unidas, together, we are changing the future. Because we know that when we uplift Latinas, we uplift families, and we uplift entire communities. So we invite you to join us and visit us to learn more at www.latinacoalition.org.
Blue Shield of California is proud to present the next inclusive conversation in today's series. Taking the field is Christina Jefferson, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with the San Francisco 49ers. Discussing policy on diversity is SVLG's lead, Racial Justice and Equity, Nadia Anderson.
CJ, thank you for being us here today. Good morning. How are you?
We are here and we are going to have a conversation. I think we all know, and this will be the conversation. So let's just get started.
Let's get to it. So I've been looking forward to this all week. We're going to do a deeper dive on the role of the diversity officer, but also whatever else comes up, we're going to have that conversation too. So let's get to it. To get started, I want to first call out that you're the 49ers' first ever hire in this role, and that you took the reins during a time when issues of race, diversity, equity, and inclusion were at a fever pitch, not only for the NFL, but for society as a whole. However, and despite this moment that we're in, many still struggle with understanding the need for the role of a chief diversity officer and what it is exactly that you do on the daily. Tell us a bit about how you came into this space and the advice that you would give others working to ingrain themselves inside of their organization and to make the case, for lack of a better word, to their leaders and maybe possibly their colleagues about the importance of having an executive whose coverage is solely focused on DE&I.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you first off for having this conversation with me. As the same, I have been looking forward to this conversation all week because we just had such a great initial conversation, and I knew that this would be amazing. Yeah, I am the first, and I think that it is an interesting space to be in. It is a space where you have to understand that oftentimes the person needs to have a sole focus because there is so much going on. It's not to say that people who aren't doing other things or have a dual focus aren't going to do a great job, but there is a level of just brain and brain space, energy that you have to have in order to do this job and do it well, because it really does require so much of you that when you're solely focused on this, you just have a better frame of reference to have the conversation. As the first one, I often say I came into this organization kind of suspicious. I understand. I've worked in diversity, equity, inclusion. I have watched my friends come and go from all kinds of organizations. We all know the horror stories of being a diversity champion inside an organization. We all know what that looks like. And so I was suspicious. I wanted to know why now? I wanted to know what they were looking for. Were they looking for someone to just sit in an office and just be, I'm the chief diversity officer, or I'm the diversity captain, or whatever that looks like? And the more I had the conversations, the more I got to know the organization, I realized that they were checking the boxes I needed them to check in order for me to come into this organization and do a good job and do the job that I know it needed to happen. And so for me, coming into the NFL at this moment, as you said, it is a lot. It's stepping on a lot of landmines all the time. And so you have to understand what you're getting into in order to do the job that needs to happen.
No, I absolutely love it. That point of making sure that they're checking the boxes for you and you're doing the same thing. It's that interviewing each other and making sure that it's the right fit. And I also love the fact that it's something that needs to be focused on 100% of the time. When I was working on my dissertation, my advisor said the same thing. She's like, you're never going to get this dissertation done if you're doing 5 minutes a day. You've got to dive into it to actually have that real impact.
Absolutely. Just really quick, I was just thinking about, I'm always talking about energy and the energy it takes to do a job and the energy it takes to the space in your brain and all the things. And to your advisor's point, it's like 5 minutes a day isn't going to get it done. And just my whole every day, I come in thinking about how I can make sure that I am continue to bring the culture that I know that is inside this organization and bring it forth and add more equity into it.
Yeah, I love it. You also mentioned our first conversation, during which you said something that resonated with me. So I want us to have that conversation in front of the audience. We touched on performative actions and the fact that these are often rooted in a desire for having a quick outcome or an immediate result when it comes to diversity and inclusion.
And this is something that is especially present when it comes to issues of race or identity. Now, as a solution to this, you mentioned a quote that was attributed to Bruce Lee, which essentially says, "Be like water." Would you mind sharing with the audience how you apply this quote to your work and also the spaces that you occupy, both personally and professionally?
Absolutely. It's something that was brought up. During our Asian Pacific Islander Month, our employees did a little kind of biography of Bruce Lee, and I really kind of took it to heart. And then it came up again. It's like one of those quotes that just keeps coming up, because I think often when people hire people to do this role, they are looking for them to stay within this kind of guardrail of what they think diversity, equity, and inclusion should be. Something that was said in the very first conversation this morning was just like, if you're going to take diversity, equity, inclusion seriously and consider it a strategic objective, then why are you not treating it as such? And so if you're really thinking about what diversity, equity, inclusion actually can bring to your organization, you're thinking about where it goes. And for me, when I think about diversity, equity, inclusion, why I came on to the 49ers is I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know where it's going to go until I get there. I don't know if I'm going to need to put a lot of my energy into working on the employee resource groups, or working with the marketing team, or working with our supplier diversity. I'm sure all of those things are important, but if you're treating diversity as a very pillared, very not having anything else to do with any other part of the organization, I personally feel like you're doing a disservice to it, because it really does go where it needs to go. You will find where it needs to go. And then the flip side of that is that you also need to be open to the fact that it is going to need adjustment. You need to be flexible. You need to understand that when you pull that one lever, it might not be the right lever at that moment. And so maybe you need to look at something else. And so for me, that's what I'm thinking about. When I think about be like water, it's not only diversity, equity, inclusion are going to take you where it needs to go, but it also is going to tell you maybe you need to divert for a second. Maybe you need to find this other channel to make the levers actually work.
I love it. I love the flexibility. I love the ability to go in where you're needed and fit, but also to be fluid and able to move and adapt to the moment. To go in that a little bit more, I want to talk a little bit about an initiative that SBLG launched where the 49ers are one of our early pledgees. So as mentioned earlier on in the program, our signature program is called Pledge 25 by 25, which is focused specifically on diversity, equity, and inclusion. For those in the audience, the quick TLDR, to use a tech phrase, is that companies commit to filling 25% of executive positions with people from underrepresented groups by 2025, or they pledge that the number of underrepresented individuals in leadership roles, and we have a definition for what a leadership role actually equates to in this context, will increase by 25% by 2025. Can you walk us through how Pledge 2025 aligns with your goals to drive DEI change across the 49ers organization? And how do you think we should be working to bring other companies along with us in this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the conversations that we've heard today about just representation. As someone who now sit on 3 boards. 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. I didn't sit on any boards. I think that I bring something that a lot of other people don't bring, because I do have just, I bring experiences of being a woman of color, being a queer woman of color, being someone who also brings my Jewishness to the conversation. I bring all of these things into a conversation with being on a board. I see things in different ways. And that's not to say that everybody else doesn't either, but, we all bring our experiences, and I bring a very unique experience, as well as my background in diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I think that when you think about boards, when you think about who's on boards, we need to make sure that what we are seeing we're representing the people and the people that we see. I always say something I say a lot inside the company is we want to represent our fans. And so if we're not representing in those leadership circles, then how are we speaking for those people? Another thing, I say a lot of things. I'm a storyteller, I can't help it. And I say that there's a little bit of arrogance in that. there's a little bit of arrogance in thinking that we can all represent each other in a way that I don't know your background. I don't know who, like, we are two different people. So how can I always say that I can represent every single person who is Black, who is queer, who is whatever? So in order to bring more people along, we need to have these boards that are representative of the cultures that we live in, and that we're not trying to become just in a little box. And, you know, and not only that, but again, when you see representation up there, again, we've heard it all day, you then see more representation. You see people who say, I can be that person. I can be that person who is different. I can be the person who doesn't look like everyone else because I have a story to tell that is important. I was also talking to someone recently who was like, you know, sometimes people feel like when they're put into a box, they're diminished. And there's something about having the space to be you in a space like a board and be able to talk through things that are so important to furthering ourselves as a society and furthering our businesses.
I think you are absolutely right. It's a substantive value, the space that, like, if you see somebody in that leadership position, you know the company really cares about it. And you also, as somebody who's working there, you see that you have a path and that you don't have to change or diminish yourself, as you said, in order to be able to get to that higher level of where you may want to go professionally. We are approaching the 2-minute warning, so to speak. So I'm going to ask the last question, and I think it's something that's very appropriate for not only this panel, but also today. And it starts off with, like, working in corporate America, we all know is generally challenging space for underrepresented persons or people who are not totally reflected in a company's makeup. However, when your role is in the field of race, equity, or inclusion, it brings new levels to this statement. And a different type of challenging emerges when you're working to kind of change from the inside. And this is because by nature, the roles are very personal, especially if you identify with the groups that you're trying to advocate for, or you're trying to, like, represent in those different types of meetings and different sessions, et cetera. So what advice do you have for people working in the role, and how do you manage the various stressors that inevitably test you on a day-to-day while working to create a better environment for all employees?
Those who know me well know that there is a large wine collection in my house. But I also tell people all the time, you've got to find the things. You can't go into this work without having a conversation with yourself about what brings joy to your world, what brings joy to your life. You also have to turn off the television every once in a while and actually be the person who, like, live in your own head rather than living in the heads of all the talking heads that are around you. Also, find the joy in the people that you work with, and also understand what you're walking into. There's not going to be any amount of self-care in the world if you're walking into an environment who does not believe in the work that you're doing, and a culture that doesn't believe what you're doing, and that your boss doesn't have your back 120%. If you don't have those things, it doesn't matter how much self-care and how much work that you've done, especially as people of color, walking into spaces like this, having to have conversations like this on days when you know there are injustices in the world.
No, I love it. And a well way to wrap up this panel. CJ, this has been magic as always. You set a really high bar for our next conversation, considering how well the first two have gone. Thank you for being here at the summit and dropping some gems for those in the audience and for all of us paying attention and watching today. Now back to our regular program. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm Gabrielle Antolovich, and I'm the board president for the Billy DeFrank LGBTQ+ Communities Center. Our mission is to provide community leadership, advocacy, services, and support to Silicon Valley's LGBTQ+ people and our allies. And we strive to be a microcosm of the vision of inclusion in society. And what that means is an understanding that we are the only minority that is actually rejected by our own families. Every other minority sticks together. And so we are the ones that are so vulnerable when we lose permanency. And that means so many of our LGBTQ youth are homeless, are in the foster care system, are in juvenile hall and committing suicide. And so our community has been rallying around all of our non-binary, trans community, because we have all of these groups. We have a gender fluid group, non-binary group, we have the Hey Girl, all-inclusive female group, we have the trans men and trans women's groups that all meet here, and we encourage everyone in the community to come to our rallies to understand that we are part of their community too. We are African American, we are Latinx, we are Indigenous, we are Asian, we are immigrants, we are everybody that's vulnerable out there. And so really, we are each other's siblings. So whenever any of us have an issue that needs to be dealt with, then all of us need to rally together out there.
Blue Shield of California now presents the final segment of today's Inclusive Conversation series, a panel, Innovating Equity Policy, What Comes Next for California. Senator Sidney Kamlager represents California's 30th Senate District and is Vice Chair of the Legislative Black Caucus. Assemblymember Evan Lowe represents California's 28th Assembly District and is Chair of the Legislature's LGBTQ Caucus and Vice Chair of the API Caucus. Assemblymember Cristina Garcia represents California's 58th Assembly District and was one of the authors and key architects of AB 979, the state's boardroom diversity bill. The panel is moderated by Peter Leroux Munoz, SVLG's General Counsel and Senior Vice President, Technology and Innovation.
Good morning and welcome everybody. It is so exciting to see everybody, and we are so incredibly lucky to be joined this morning by several great leaders in our legislature, Senator Kamlager and Assemblywoman Cristina Garcia. We unfortunately were not able to be joined by Assemblymember Lowe. He was called away at the last minute on official business. But it is great to have the two of you with us for this important discussion today. And it's important also to note that this discussion takes place against the backdrop of the breaking news of the Kyle Rittenhouse acquittal news, which just came out. People will undoubtedly recall that Mr. Rittenhouse was a shooter at a social justice protest last summer in Wisconsin. And I think that breaking news really does underscore the importance of today's discussion and this larger community and nationwide discussion around racial justice and equity. With that background in mind, I would certainly welcome any comments from the senator to that late breaking news that we have just heard.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this panel. It's always good to be anywhere in close proximity to Assemblymember Cristina Garcia, who is our fearless champion for the Legislative Women's Caucus and has been a champion for women's rights and the rights of the LGBTQ community, the immigrant community, and so many more. Disturbing, disheartening, unfortunate, unsurprising. I think it underscores the deep division and polarization that we continue to see in this country. And it is a reminder that hate is far easier to sow than love. I think that is why, I certainly do this work and why I work to partner with warriors like Assemblymember Garcia, because our voices are needed more than ever before. Really unfortunate.
And Assemblywoman Garcia, we'd certainly welcome your comments as well on this late breaking news.
I think a lot of the same sentiments that the good senator shared. At times it feels like we've become, as a person of color, I feel like I need to become numb to the constant disappointment that I think we encounter, like not surprising, but I think each of these opportunities, I want to believe that it can be different, that we are turning a page and moving forward. And it feels like one step forward, many steps back out there. I have had colleagues during this interim tell me like, oh, you've done enough. Like, can we take a pause? We can't keep asking for more. And it's a reminder that we haven't done enough and we have so much more work to do out there. And so I think you see kind of like some calmness amongst the senator and I, but I think we've just unfortunately have been trained to not let that rage that I think we live with on a regular basis come forward in order to be able to not give up and to keep fighting for change. And so, yeah, I'm very disappointed by this and just kind of what it says about our society.
And understanding what you just talked about there about continuing to push for social change, even through disappointment, even through setbacks. You know, today it still nonetheless seems that there is an increased appetite from a growing segment of the public for forward-thinking policies and more equitable outcomes for communities and populations that have been traditionally excluded and or neglected. What are your thoughts on what is behind this kind of shift within the populace, and where do you think we're going next from a legislative point of view when it comes to social justice and equity? And Assemblywoman, why don't we start with you?
So I because of the verdict just came down, I think you're going to find me a little more pessimistic at times about whether I always ask myself, are they really committed to this change and the inconveniences that it might come to people of privilege, people with power, as this is about power dynamics and sharing that power with groups that haven't normally had it. And I'm not sure that when it comes to actually putting these beliefs into practice, that we have the same support out there. But you know, I will say that I'll stick to some of the work that I've been doing. We've been talking about corporate boards and diversity amongst corporate boards. You know, in your openings mentioned AB 979, and very proud of that work that I got to do side by side with Mr. Holden and be a partner with him. But we always talk about how people talk about how that was a watershed moment and we flew open a door. And for me, it's not. It's like, how do we diversify, you know, the whole rung of the ladder? And how do we also make it clear that those bills like 979 are just the floor and not where we really need to be? And a lot more work to do. And so I'm hoping that companies will come up with diversity plans. And in that have metrics. I love numbers, and tell us, where are you starting at? What does your diversity look like? And what's your goal, and how do you plan to get there? And then share it with us. Don't be afraid to share it with us. If you're committed to these goals, share it with us. And then I do hope that those people that have that appetite for more change are more committed to social justice will help hold these companies accountable. But I think before we get to that point, help them with that transition and reward the companies, you know, who are doing that through their bottom lines and their profits. I'm not, you know, I think the carrot works great also to begin with out there. But you know, we're far from being equitable, whether it's on gender, on race, on sexual orientation, on so many other things that we need to do to be inclusive. And I like to start off by saying, where are we starting at? And let's share that data point, and that lets us know the work we still have to do. And I hope that companies also embrace that.
Senator, let's turn to you next. What is kind of next from a legislative point of view on some of these social justice and equity issues?
Well, you know, I think, I hope, but I also think that we'll be moving into 2022 thinking about the mental health, mental illness pandemic that this country, or explosion that this country is now facing, and also the climate catastrophe that is in front of us. And on the outset, you may think, well, that has nothing to do with discussions around inclusion. But my hope is that while we're talking about those very big issues that are incredibly complicated, we are infusing the economics of all of these discussions, you know, into those policy areas. Because I actually believe that if you are going to talk about, you know, inclusion and building equity, you also have to talk about economics. And when people are not poor, when people feel like they have options that are viable options, behaviors change, patterns change, desires for coalition building and compromise change. But when people feel like their backs are against the wall and they have no other options, you know, those kinds of perceptions and feelings and realities really do beget perceptions and behaviors and tropes and stereotypes and biases that we continue to see unfold, and where we also continue to see people harmed. And so I hope that we will begin to talk about economics. Yes, we did some great things with corporate boards and having those be diversified, making sure that we have gender equity on our boards and commissions, you know, but then we did yes, we have done things like piloting out guaranteed universal basic income programs. We've also done things like getting rid of the tampon tax and getting rid of the diaper tax. I mean, those are also areas of discussion that are about inclusion, that are about equity, and that are also about economics. And so I hope that businesses, labor, and policymakers can begin to talk about how we create economic equity and fairness to create that, so that we are allowed to really attack some of the other social constructs and biases and illnesses that we're dealing with, you know, that we're never going to see real change if we're also not talking about an economic investment.
And Senator, I want to drill down into something you just said there in terms of addressing some of these issues, working together. It's going to require a cooperative effort and people kind of all pulling in the same direction. Now, you both are a member of various affinity caucuses. From your respective points of view, where do you see those opportunities for cooperation around some of these priority issues coming up in the next year? And Senator, why don't we stay with you for this one?
Sure. Well, I'm incredibly focused on environmental issues. I know the Assembly member is as well. But one of the things I continue to say is, you know, Black and brown folks in urban areas are not merely consumers. We are also developers, and we can be part of the infrastructure. We can be part of the innovation. We can be part of the manufacturing, the development, and the distribution. And so stop coming to us with an end product and asking us to buy it in order to buy into something. And also stop coming to us with crumbs when 85% of the thing has already been developed. You know, there is this assumption that Black and brown, or, you know, sort of communities with lower income zip codes don't have the capacity to create. And I see hustlers everywhere in my district, okay, on almost all corners. So I know that we have the entrepreneurial and the innovative spirit to do that. So my hope is that as we're talking about how to build a green, clean economy, that we're just not coming into my district with an end product. We are coming in the beginning to say, how do we use your talents, to leverage your talents, so that we're all working together to create the thing that we are also then going to take back to our communities and ask them to buy into, so that we can save this planet. And I just wish that we would operate under that approach in more spaces than we do.
Assembly member, how about you? What are some priorities for your respective affinity caucuses next year?
You know, I think definitely the environment and environmental justice at the forefront is something that's important to all of us out there. We were going to talk about equity, our most marginalized communities, and allowing those communities to be at the table and lead. I always think it's interesting. I live in an area where I have the most density of Latinos, and we have the most Latino congressional district, and the latest proposal is splitting that up and diluting our power out there and putting us with folks where historically we've been drowned out there. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of talent, but there's been a lot of things that have worked against us to silence us. And I think there's this false narrative, like we're like the sleeping giant, the Latino community in my background. It's like, there's nothing sleeping about us. Just like Ms. Kamlager, we're out there hustling. We're thriving in spite of, but I do think that as we move forward, that we need to ensure that those opportunities are happening in my backyard, and we're creating good quality jobs, middle class jobs that allow you to move on up into the upper class as well. And not assuming that there's not talent there. I can't be the only person who has talent in my backyard. Actually, I think there's a lot of us out there. And so I do hope that we see that as we invest, and we have these record levels of investments happening again next year with the budget that we are going to have. But I think we also need to be looking at just economic inclusion, like the senator said, beyond the environment. And so all our policies need to include that at this point. Inflation is a big talk out there. And, you know, it is distressing when folks on the day-to-day are feeling the price of basics, milk, cheese, diapers increase 30%, but our salaries are not increasing at that level. And our ability to move on up is also not moving as quickly as we see that out there. And so I do think that there's the commitment amongst our various caucuses and where we can work together to try to ensure we're sharing some of that wealth. It is not just about giving someone a check, and that maybe is a good start, but ensuring that they have the ability to put those hustling skills to create a career that they're proud of, to create multi-generational wealth, and to create the products that we desire in our communities and that we need in our communities.
An assembly member, you know, talking about opportunities to create that generational wealth and to be a creator. I think a lot of that goes back to leadership opportunities within a corporate setting. And I just wanted to return briefly to AB 979, the board diversity bill. You know, we've seen that many private companies now are working to diversify their corporate boards. Thanks to AB 979, publicly held corporations headquartered in California are required to diversify their boards of directors by adding directors from underrepresented communities by the end of this year. And Assembly Member, you were a co-author of this legislation, and it was widely supported by affinity groups and other organizations, including the leadership group. Can you give us just a little bit of the background, maybe kind of the behind the curtain? How did that bill, you know, really kind of come to be? Because that doesn't seem like an easy lift. So what was the story there? And maybe what are some next steps that we can take from there?
So, you know, Hannibal Jackson did the gender bill, and during that discussion, there was a discussion about other marginalized groups and why are we just limiting it to women? And as people were counting votes and trying to figure out the political will, it's like, maybe we can't do it all. So let's take this first step, which is important, and let's make sure we figure out the next steps later. And one of the fears.
Oh, there we go. Assembly Member.
I apologize. That we're going to end up with diversity of gender, but not diversity in other terms, right? Gender can be the only marker out there for diversity. And sure enough, the early data showed us that we did a lot of progress to add women to the boards, but the women were not looking like the women you have on this panel out there. And so that data was helpful, but I think as the public was forced to look at the injustice that with the George Floyd video, that injustice existed long before, and a lot of people have noticed and have lived it. But that video made it to a lot of people could no longer ignore it and could no longer be inconvenienced. And so it allowed us to go back to that discussion and say, can we take that next step now? And like, when we were working on the bill, people were like, this is enough of a step. And I was like, this is great, but this is not enough of a step. I can't just diversify and create a floor for boards, but how do we make sure we create inclusion up and down the rung? And then that once you bring me in, that I'm valued and I have the support, and I'm not just the only person, because it's a lot to carry on my shoulders if I have to be somehow representing diversity out there. There's a lot out there as well. And so I think there's many more steps to go, but that was the opportunity that we saw. And you know, Mr. Holden has been a staunch leader in this space, you know, for a long time. And we came together and we said, remember that conversation with that last bill, the time is now. Let's move unapologetically and let's try to do as much as we can. And him and I have said it's not enough, and we are, you know, hoping everyone will come to the table to figure out what are the next steps that we need to do in this, because our fear is still that we're gonna have diversity, but it still won't look like society, or somehow we're going to be pitted one against the other when we're all marginalized. And this is not like the oppression Olympics out there in any capacity. And so, you know, we will continue to track the data. We will continue to push and make it clear that this is just the floor, and we're far from being where we need to be on corporate diversity or anything else for that matter.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. And Senator, you know, as somebody in the other house, how did you view AB 979 as it was working its way through the process? And what was your perspective watching that kind of grow and evolve over time?
So AB 979 actually became a priority bill for the California Legislative Black Caucus because it was authored by Assemblymember Holden. So we were very excited, and we're hopeful that it would actually pass the finish line, because as the Assembly member can attest, sometimes you come up with a really good idea that makes sense in your mind and seems very practical, and then the thing explodes somewhere in committee or on the floor. So I was very supportive of it, and was grateful actually that it was being introduced, because I'd actually raised concerns with Senator Jackson at the time her bill was circulating on the Assembly floor, where I was in the Assembly at the time, because I said, you know, with all due respect, Senator, this is certainly going to help white women, but it is not going to move the needle for Black, Brown, API women. And so we have to be honest when we're talking about inclusion and equity, and ask ourselves, you know, in today's society, how is this language going to be read? And who are the first people that are going to come to mind? Because the first people that come to mind are going to be the first folks that people run to recruit to put on the boards. And those women are not going to look like me. They're not going to look like the Assembly member. They're not going to represent our API or our Indigenous and Native American communities. So I was very excited that this bill was making it through, and that there was the kind of support that was needed really by all of the ethnic caucuses to get it across the finish line. But there's a lot of work to do. You know, the reality is, I think, you know, businesses and industries have to begin to think outside of the box. We have to move beyond quotas, where it's okay that we have 2 or we have 3 or we have 4 and we don't have to do enough. We can't find folks of color, and then always have them be responsible for the diversion or the outreach or the communications issues, and not like the financing, business development, or some of the other areas that are of issue and importance to boards that generally get relegated to, you know, white men. We have to work to not always ask the same 5 Black, Brown, Asian people that we know, because there are more of us out there. And ultimately, I think organizations have to be really true to their own bottom line. And as creative as your A&R or R&D people are to come up with a great product, you should be equally creative when it comes to figuring out ways to support, you know, authentic diversity on your boards and on your leadership or in your C-suite teams.
Senator, I think you're exactly right that there's a lot more that can be done. And we've seen a growing conversation around the need to increase representation to corporate executives and leadership, just beyond boards as well. And we've seen these calls at all levels of government, on social media, and even from people inside of major tech and professional service companies. And as a result, there are a number of initiatives out there focused on diversifying corporate leadership, including the Silicon Valley Leadership Group's own Pledge 25 by 25 program, which is focused on corporate executives and people in leadership positions. Now, what are your thoughts on corporate diversity in Silicon Valley? Do you see this as a place where legislation or increased action is needed? Is there something else? What's your perspective on the Valley as a whole, as a leading center for innovation in America? And Assemblywoman, why don't we start with you?
So I think it's great that there's been a goal of 25 by 25 set, but if you think about different ethnic groups or gender or different identities that we have out there, we're much more than 25% of the population. And so I'd like to see our boards and corporations look like our society out there. And so I do think it's good to have a goal. I think it's like, how do we move past that as an interim goal, and how do we make sure that this is laying the foundation so we can move past that, and we can move past that in a timely manner and not 50 years from now. And so I think that that's the next step that needs to be done with this goal. How is this setting the foundation for the steps we need to take after that as well? I think tied to that goal, I would also ask the question is, what does attrition look like? We're recruiting people, they're coming in, great. What does attrition look like? out there as well. Because I think one of the things that happens since, you know, I've been recruited, I participate, and then I feel like the crazy woman in the room because no one else has my experience or my, you know, my opinions, and it's like, just be quiet because you're it's too much at once. And so I always tell folks, like, well, make sure there's more than just me in the room, because that's one way to support me out there. And so I think that that's the other piece that we have to also look into this. Once we recruit, what's the support we're creating so that people really feel like they're part of that team and their contributions are valued and that change is happening out there as well. And so, you know, I always want to believe that companies to do it on their own, but this issue of diversity in corporate boards, even before the Hannah Bitch Jackson, is something that the diversity caucuses were asking about. And they're like, oh, we can't even share you that data. And we waited for folks to do it on their own, and they didn't do it on their own. And so encourage that action on their own. But I do think that there's a place for legislation to say, hey, this is good, and I will give you, you know, a star for that. But we have a lot more to go. And how do I help you get there a little bit sooner?
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Senator, your thoughts?
Well, I certainly don't want to feel like we have to legislate good behavior. And sometimes I feel like that's what we're asked to do. And folks need to just kind of step up and be honest and do it on their own. You know, specific to the tech community and Silicon Valley, you know, algorithms, right? So we have a lot of discussions about algorithms and privacy, you know, everything from sort of like facial recognition technology to, you know, how these autonomous self-driving cars see people if they see people, and, you know, all of that, right? So there's that. But if you want to extrapolate that, a great friend of mine wrote a book, The Algorithms of Oppression. So I think Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous folks don't want to be seen as a token hire. B, folks don't want to be sort of, hey, we're looking for the diversity thing. Let's go ahead and find this business or this idea to purchase and bring in to the larger companies so that we can now say we're diverse and we care about inclusion. I think we can kind of read through that. Those are very transparent actions. I think there should be real discussions on, you know, venture capitalists. And it seems like, you know, a lot more leeway and benefit of the doubt is given to white inventors and creators and folks starting businesses, startups, than to other, you know, folks, Black, Brown, API, Indigenous. You know, it seems like those folks have to jump through far more hoops, you know, just to get consideration from the Silicon Valley community. So, and then you have to talk about, like, which we see everywhere, okay, this is not specific to this industry, but, you know, toxic workplace environments. These are, you know, high pressure, high value, you know, high reward companies because of the industry. And so I do think you have a real opportunity, but obligation to confront the workplaces and the environments and the cultures in which you all are operating and in which you all are searching for the next big thing. Because the reality is technology is not going anywhere, but the other reality is like everyone should be able to play in that space. I have USC in my district. I did a tour at the Department of Cinematic Arts. They were talking about coding and gaming, you know, and there's a real push to try to find, you know, Black and Brown students that want to get into it because there's such great reward, so much money that can be made out of it. And why is it that we have to really articulate a vision for this specific population? It's because they are rendered invisible, you know, in Silicon Valley. So as we continue to become far more dependent on technology than I would like, I think we have a real obligation to figure out how to make sure that it's accessible for everyone at all levels.
Thank you, Senator. You know, I want to return to something that we addressed at the very top of our discussion, and that was the verdict that just came out for Kyle Rittenhouse. As we look back at the last year, following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, we saw a number of companies throughout California show signs of allegiance with movements and programs designed to address systemic racism and other issues of justice and equality. And many companies took substantive steps, but now we're seeing that there are some questions about whether those gestures from last year were simply done maybe in the moment, and they've kind of been forgotten as time has gone by. What message do you have for Silicon Valley and Bay Area corporations about the importance of sustaining momentum and progress towards racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? And Senator, why don't we start with you?
I would just implore folks to lean into the work. It is uncomfortable. You probably will hear things that you don't want to hear, but lean in. There were so many pledges that were made, right, during 2020, and people are still looking for the fruition of those pledges. So, own up to what you say you're going to do and lean into the uncomfortable space for a while.
Senator, thank you for that. And in our last 60 seconds, we'll turn it over to the Assembly member.
And I would say that this is an everyday work we have to put in. It's not just a statement or you were looking for that quick fix. And so we have to be committed to asking ourselves these tough questions on a regular basis and having those tough conversations as well on a regular basis. And change is hard. We're asking for a cultural shift and a cultural change, and we're asking for people with power. We're asking for the CEOs of these companies to share that power, to share that wealth out there. And saying something is easy in the moment and then scary when it's like, let's actually put this into action. But I think you have a responsibility, both socially, but a responsibility to your bottom line to add teeth to your statements. Because I think at some point, at some point people want to say, I want to believe you, but we quickly were like, well, we're not surprised, so let's move on someplace and let me have my dollars elsewhere as well out there. And so, it can be a one and done thing. And I think as we're leading this change, it needs to include different voices at the table. Like, just can't be the same people who have been leading these institutions, making those decisions of what that looks like out there either. And so I encourage these companies not to be afraid of what we're saying you need to be doing. And the sooner you start to do that, I think the sooner you're going to have allies in us to say, hey, we want to reward that, we want to celebrate, and we want to show other companies that it is possible, and there are examples of doing it right for all of us.
Very good. My thanks to both of you for this illuminating conversation. Thank you again for all of your leadership.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Audrey Soriano, and I'm the Senior Associate for Silicon Valley Leadership Group's Racial Justice and Equity team. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our Pledge 25 by 25 initiative. Pledge 25 by 25 is a Silicon Valley movement that challenges Bay Area and Silicon Valley companies to increase representation for executives and people in leadership positions. The goals are simple. Fill 25% of executive positions with people from underrepresented groups, or increase the number of people in leadership roles by 25% by the year 2025. So we're thrilled to have more than a dozen companies who have already taken 25 by 25 pledge, one of which is Genentech, the first company to do so. Genentech's work is focused on fostering belonging for their people in the cities and companies they serve through the partnerships that strengthen diversity and inclusion across healthcare, education, and more. Fundamentally, they believe that advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion needs broad societal transformation, and their work beyond their walls, in collaboration with others, is a testament to their commitment. Please join me in a warm welcome for Quita Highsmith, Genentech's Chief Diversity Officer, who is joined by our CEO, Ahmad Thomas, for the Pledge 25 by 25 Spotlight interview.
Quita Highsmith, Chief Diversity Officer at Genentech. It is great to see you. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk to us about DEI and your journey this morning.
Thanks, Ahmad. I'm happy to be here.
So let's just get started to learn more about you. You are an incredible leader here in Silicon Valley, an incredible national voice around DEI issues. And frankly, and unfortunately for women of color, leaders of color, Black women in positions like yours, it's just not that common. How did you get to where you are, and what were some of the highlights along your journey?
Well, I'm certainly happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me. Let me just say at the outset, I never thought that I would be doing diversity and inclusion work because it always sat in human relations, and I'm actually not the most compliant person on the planet. So I'm sure I would not have been successful in HR. However, I'm coming from a business background.
Right.
And so I have been in the industry almost 3 decades. I started at Genentech in 2010 and came in as the national sales director for one of our brands, and then moved to the head of sales and marketing for another brand and was the franchise head. And then I went into government affairs and was leading alliance and advocacy relations. And when I was leading advocacy relations, we had wanted to do a patient summit, and I wanted to ensure that for our audience that we would have patients of color that had participated in the clinical research. And unfortunately, we could not find one patient at that time of color that had participated in the research. And that led me and a coworker to really start to ask, well, why is that? Why is there no patients of color that we can find that have participated in research? And really what we learned is that clinical research is about 90% of the patients who participate in the studies are of European ancestry. And so it led us to develop one of our pillars at the company, advancing inclusive research. So that was in 2017. Fast forward to 2021, we're making great strides. And I have been able to use this platform in my role as Chief Diversity Officer to really elevate the needs for the organization. And I wanted to come at it from a business perspective. Right. And luckily, I report to the CEO, Alexander Hardy, who has been instrumental in ensuring that what we call you budget what you value, that you have the resources, right, that you have the staff, that you have the things necessary to be successful. So I'm super excited about the work that we've done at Genentech, and I think we are well on our way in this journey.
Well, and that's very interesting looking at your background, that it's been so diverse in terms of the set of experiences that you've had, the lived experience and the experience across multiple verticals. You've been very successful at being able to drive and operationalize change. Is it because of that diverse background? Is it because you have a business mentality when you go about driving social change? Or is it not relevant? Is it all lived experience? Talk to us about that.
I think that it's all relevant, right? Because when you understand how the business works, when you understand profit and loss, and when you understand how to influence, then you can make real change. And for me, when I came in January of 2020 to become the Chief Diversity Officer, I really said to the organization, we have to have a strategy that it's going to be bigger than just the people, right? Because I think so many times in diversity and inclusion, it is a strategy about, well, how many people can I get in this certain seat? And what I have found is people get resistant to that because they feel like they're trying to take my seat and give it to an unqualified person, right? And so if you have a strategy that is just focused on people, you will get resistance. But what you still want to do is you want to focus a broad strategy. So our strategy is threefold. One, it is foster belonging, because you do want every employee to feel respected. We want every employee to feel like they belong to the organization and can make it a great place to work. But then we also have to have a business aspect of it. And that's our initiative around advancing inclusive research and health equity. And if the pandemic has taught us nothing, it has taught us that health equity matters. It has also taught us that people are looking at the data and the numbers. Because if we think about these vaccines, and if they had not had representation in those studies, then the uptake by people of color would have been even slower.
Yeah.
Right. So so the marketplace is now understanding we have to have communities of color engaged in the research. And then for us, our third pillar is transform society. And this is, how do we use the vast resources that we have to drive change? And for example, we now ask all of our vendors that we're going to do an RFP over $500,000, 6 questions around what are their efforts around diversity and inclusion, because we want to be an influencer. And then we know for our line of work, being in the biotech industry, that we have an initiative called Kindergarten to Careers, where we've got to be able to help fund and help find and help educate the next generation of PhDs and MDs and MBAs. So I do think having a broad background and a broad strategy is critical for driving real change with diversity and inclusion.
Well, that's very well said. And obviously, Genentech, biotech, when you talk about healthcare, my own experiences, unfortunately, my own family, looking at getting the vaccine for some of my family members, that was a big jump. Now, thankfully, everyone's jumped and got on board, but rightly so, there is some trepidation in certain communities sometimes about being trusting. But, maybe if we shift to first principles, because you've outlined so well kind of those 3 core components of how your CEO, Alexander, how you, Genentech's leadership, view DEI. What does inclusion and diversity mean to you? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to Genentech? Are those even the right words when you start at first principles defining this set of issues?
Yeah. I think diversity and inclusion is so multifaceted. Let's get real for a minute, right? D&I is complex. There are a whole host of systemic problems and issues, and there is not going to be one solve, right? It is going to be really a steel drive and commitment, and we have to be intentional. We have to be transparent, and we have to think about, where are people at on their journey? And let's just move them along, right? Because some of us are further down the road of the journey than others. And I think the thing that we have to be thinking about is progress. So many times we're looking for perfection, but perfection is not going to get us there. If we can get everyone progressing and taking one more step, then I think that we will see some actual results. And I believe we're starting to see some results with our programs that we have. I think the other thing is, and this is new for us in the employment environment, but I think 2020, between George Floyd, between the pandemic, it gave us a little bit of time to sit still and to really see what was going on. And I think that it gave us an opportunity as well to stop tiptoeing around the issues of race at work. We had to start having the conversation. The employees were looking for us to have the conversation, because so many times we assume homogeneity in the workplace, which says everybody has the same work experience, but we often know that LGBTQ, Black, Hispanic, Asians may have a different experience, and it is time to start talking about that.
Well, you're talking about real conversations, and I hope our audience can see Quita is real and authentic, and I'm sure that's also been a driver of your success throughout your career. But results, what are the key metrics when you're talking about DEI and Genentech? And maybe I would ask to be open and real. I get to talk to many executives. We have many community members and leaders of color who follow what we're doing at SVLG, representing so many of you all, great companies. And there is a healthy dose of skepticism about why is this different? I look around, I hear a lot of very great pronouncements, but I don't
Yeah.
necessarily see a lot of diversity on the Zoom calls when we're talking to CEOs. So what are those metrics, and do those metrics combat skepticism? Is the skepticism no longer relevant? How do you view that, and how does that tie to those results?
Yeah, you absolutely have to have results, right? And I think, one of the places that we at Genentech have seen some results, and I think gender is a bit easier than race and ethnicity. When we think about,
Why is that, Quita? Because
you know,
I hear that a lot. I've got my own set of views, but why is that?
Because for one, I think when you're in a company like a Genentech, whose parent company is Roche, which is a global organization, 100,000 employees across the world, race and ethnicity is really more of a U.S. It's more of a U.S. Whereas women, men that's more across the world, right? So I think it's an easier place to start. And we've had success there. We've taken the lessons that we've learned over the last 10 years to really be able to move the needle, where our officers and director community is now 51% women. For the first time, we have the head of Genentech's research and early development is a woman. And so we're starting to see real meaningful difference when it comes to gender. But we don't have 10 years to wait to make some changes with race and ethnicity. And I'm happy to share that at Genentech, our head of product development is a Black man. And so we're starting to really see areas of opportunity, and we've invested in the business. And so when we think about who we are bringing into the organization, but our business, we did a study in COVID-19 pneumonia impacta that did get emergency use authorization. 85% of the study participants came from communities of color, Navajo Nation, Oakland. We went to Kenya, Brazil, Mexico, and we have to start seeing those investments in the business. Because then when it's a business imperative, then people get on board. And so our representation, while we all got to do work, but we are seeing, from our most senior leaderships in the C-suite to the Genentech board of directors, where we have made commitments to ensure that we're bringing both gender and race representation to the forefront.
Well, and on that representation question, and I think that's very well said as you talk about your comprehensive approach. Genentech has been a great partner, a real leader in the 25 by 25 effort of Silicon Valley Leadership Group, where companies commit to meet a real metric by 2025 around diverse leadership and investment in diverse communities. You have not just buy-in, but you have a push from the top, from your CEO around 25 by 25 and around your set of initiatives driving this change. How important is that? And, why do you think metrics like this are important to drive change across industry?
I think for one, it's about transparency, right? So when you make a public commitment, like we have made with this pledge to the 2025, and then we put out on our own Genentech website, our 2025 commitments, then we've got to be held accountable, right? So it's not just we're whispering about it inside the company walls. We're actually making a public declaration to say, please hold us accountable. Here's what we're trying to do. And I do think that as we think about potential employees today are looking to see what are companies doing around social justice. And so for us, our 2025 commitments, which align with the Pledge 2025, is to double Black and Hispanic representation of directors, officers, and extended leadership. Here in the Bay Area, in our organization, we have a large Asian population, and we want to mirror Asian representation of directors and officers to the workforce. Right. And we still, even though 51% of our women are in officer director roles, there's still some opportunities as we think about various STEM roles, medical directors, engineers, that we want to continue to double down and ensure that we've got representation. So I'm excited for Genentech to be a part of this. And I'm hoping, Ahmad, next year you'll be coming back to us and asking us, well, what did you do? What were your results? Because that's how we're going to make real change.
Right. Well, if you take that change beyond Genentech, because Genentech clearly is a leader in this biotech space around DEI and belonging and representation. You've gone to one of the best business schools in the world. Clearly the data and the analytics behind the business case are very important. Is the business case the key driver of this change happening collectively across industry? Is it because it's the right thing to do? How do you take Genentech's progress and drive it across an entire industry, which frankly, I think if you would stereotype biotech, it's one of those industries that perhaps isn't the most diverse, certainly at the highest levels.
Yeah. I think one of the things that is critical is all of us have to start asking more questions. And I believe real change starts at home. So you have to ask, what are we doing in our organization to make real change? And then I think to your point about others in the industry, we've been sharing the work that we've been doing with our industry partner, pharma, and many of the companies are engaging in a number of initiatives, and pharma has taken that up as well. But when I tell you that when we did we're doing our RFP process, and we're asking these questions, it is resonating because suppliers that maybe didn't have a DE&I program, guess what? You want to work with Genentech? We're asking these questions. Do you have a diverse staffing commitment? What % of your workforce is leadership, is women of color and people of color and women and LGBTQ? What awards have you won? When we start asking those questions, it makes people pay attention and listen, because they want to be able to have access to the resources that we have. And so I believe that our opportunity is that wherever we have to follow the money. Wherever we're spending resources is where we have to start asking questions and saying to our own suppliers, you want to work with us, then we want to see you step up. And let me just say, it has been working.
Well, I can imagine it certainly would, given your buying power and given the influence that Genentech has. And you talk about the three core goals around DEI: the inclusive research, health and equity, the strategic partnerships, fostering belonging internally. It is clearly a well thought out strategic framework that you're enacting, and I'm very pleased to hear of the progress that you've reported. I'm sure it has not all been gravy throughout the process. What are the impediments maybe that you've faced thus far, or that you see in terms of challenges to reaching the goals?
So I think there is a couple of impediments and challenges. One is we don't need any more allies. And let me be clear on that. What we need are change makers, right? Let's talk about the difference between an ally and a change maker, right? An ally is someone who says, I support the cause. I'm here for you. They support the cause, but they won't take a risk. When it comes to seeing a microaggression that might have taken place in a conversation they were in, they won't say anything in the moment. Right? They may come back and tell somebody else, oh, I think maybe, right? What we really need to make real change is people who are willing to take a risk, willing to step up and actively fight for better change. So for one, we need more change makers. I think the other thing is too, oftentimes women of color and people of color, they don't have the same sponsorship opportunities, meaning, that there's not somebody who went to their school who looks like them, acts like them. The echo chamber around them is different. And so when the plum assignment comes, where somebody says, am I willing to take the risk? Those people are sometimes left out of the conversation.
Yeah.
And so how do we think about ensuring that underrepresented employees have the same opportunities as others? And then I would say the final area where I think we still have a lot of opportunity is what I call the frozen middle. And so these are the next level down, because for us, all of our officer community have diversity inclusion plans. Everybody has a D&I plan. Not only do they have their own individual D&I plan, but those plans are on our intranet, so our internal website.
Right.
So any employee in the company can look at all of our officers' plans. But this frozen middle, oftentimes have been, how do I say this? They've been blissfully unaware that there are issues, and oftentimes they're the ones that are doing the majority of the hiring. And so we really need to think about how do we engage this group, which is a large group, where they may be hiring one or two people, and the experiences of the people on those teams, that matters for our retention. That matters for who's coming in, because that person coming in could be the next level leadership. So I do think that the frozen middle is an opportunity for us to continue to refine our actions and messages.
That's such a great point, Quita. We think about 25 by 25, which is very focused on the top. And the point is you have a compounding effect. A leader is able to come in with a diverse background, add representation, and almost magically you see hires beneath them start to look differently. But that frozen middle is tough to get at. We've had some companies that we've heard about incentive structures that can work to try and drive change there. But certainly a very good point. But your point about change makers and being a change maker really resonates with me. It makes me look in the mirror, because I think back to microaggressions and things that I've seen over the course of my career. And maybe 15 years ago, I didn't say anything. And I it's hard to swallow that you didn't. Now that you're in a position of influence, I certainly would. But if you look back, or if I think back to myself 20 years ago, especially for the employees of color, you don't have the leeway to speak out.
Right.
Is there a culture at Genentech where you think that's changing? Because I can tell you, I didn't feel that I might be able to speak out and not have it. It might be a perception that was off. I'm just sharing authentically how I felt.
No, I do believe the culture is changing. So, I'll give you a personal example. When I came into the organization in 2010, because we people of color oftentimes have to code switch. And so for folks in the audience, code switch means that you try to act like the majority. And so I wore my hair straight, and I was spending hours a day, thousands of dollars a week going to the beauty salon so that my hair could seem more Eurocentric. Because that was what I didn't have any leaders that did not have straight hair. And so fast forward 2019, I just felt in my true self was like, I'm wasting time trying to look like something that I'm never going to be. I'm getting paid to deliver on the work that I'm doing. So I don't need to be distracted by something else. And I cut all my hair off and went natural. And you know what? I got promoted, right? Because I could concentrate more on the work at hand versus trying to emulate something and wasting a lot of time and money. And so I encourage people to be authentic, and my very presence, right, creates possibilities, because then other women of color say, I can be my authentic self at work. And the opposite of belonging is fitting in. And we need to ensure that we're no longer have people in the echo chamber, but we're really trying to think more broadly, because innovation needs to happen. And if you have the same people who went to the same schools and have the same friend set and have the same background, then the opportunity for us to innovate is going to be reduced.
Quita, it's inspiring to talk to you, your openness, how frank you've been about these issues. I'm inspired to see a company like Genentech with Alexander and all that you all are doing to authentically drive change. How can we help you? How can we help companies like Genentech see this change through?
You know, the thing that I would ask for all of us is we've got to take more risk, right? We've got to think bigger and bolder, because that is what is going to move the needle, right? We have been stagnant for a while. You said at the beginning, the CEO suite hasn't changed that much. And we have to be the generation that makes that change, but we have to be willing to take some risk. We have to be willing to say we're going to be bolder in our quest. And we have to be thinking about this journey not as a sprint, but a marathon, right? And who are we grooming to take that seat and making sure that they are ready. But we can no longer continue to praise the power of diversity while underrepresented voices are absent. It lacks credibility.
Wow. Thank you again, Quita. We're running this marathon right with you at your side and here to advance this change. If you hear this and you don't want to be a change maker, you might be in the wrong place. Thank you, Quita. Incredible conversation.
Thanks so much, Ahmad.
Up next at the Innovating Equity Summit, the closing keynote conversation with John Rice, founder and CEO of Management Leadership for Tomorrow. Talking with him, SVLG CEO Ahmad Thomas.
I'm delighted to be sitting down with John Rice, founder and CEO of Management Leadership for Tomorrow, or MLT. Through MLT, he's focused on creating career opportunities for the next generation leaders of color. MLT's Black Equity at Work certification is the first of its kind, clear standard and roadmap for companies looking to be leaders on racial equity. Prior to MLT, John held executive posts with the NBA and the Walt Disney Company. John, we're honored to have you here with us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Ahmad.
Well, let's start on MLT. I know a lot about your organization. I know many of us who've gone to business school are familiar with your impact. But for the Silicon Valley leaders in the audience, tell us more about what you do at MLT and who you work with.
The short story in MLT is, we're nearly 20-year-old nonprofit organization that really focuses on advancing racial equity in this country, and we focus on two areas, two key levers to move the needle. The first one is on the individual side, which really focuses on putting more economic mobility, economic power, and influence in the hands of people of color, and that's helping them go from college to those first jobs, that actually the kinds of first jobs that close the deal in economic mobility for them and their families, and we also provide the coaching and the high performance playbook and the social capital to help Black and brown students and professionals advance through key thresholds toward the senior leadership ranks where they can have a high impact both in their organizations and their communities. We've worked with about 10,000 folks project to date, about 2,500 fellows on an annual basis that go through our programs, again, that span college through the senior executive suite. And our goal is really to develop 1,000 plus senior leaders. We're about 40% there. So we've got some more work to do, but we're excited about our progress. The second lever that is really focused on the institutional side of our work. We work with about 200 companies, many in the tech sector and out in the Valley, and help them take essentially a more rigorous approach to moving the needle on DEI. And we think that's obviously important because, for employers to move the needle on DEI, that widens the road certainly for individuals. And And essentially, we work with about 200 organizations, and with a comprehensive suite of offerings to help them move the needle on DEI and racial equity, from campus recruiting, lateral recruiting, helping them advance and retain the talent that they have, as well as an advisory offering. We have a consulting arm that helps them the how-to strategies and tactics of moving the needle toward critical mass of diverse talent at all stages of your organization. And about a year ago, we also launched a racial equity certification that helps to kind of establish an absolute standard for racially equitable workplace practices. So we've got a two-pronged model. We're excited about the progress, and it's really we're about an organization that has about 200 folks that are based all around the country, and we have a real focus over the past 6 to 7 years on moving the needle and diversifying the tech sector with a full team out in the Bay Area as well.
Well, John, let's double click on moving the needle. And you talk about your partnerships, the companies, 200 plus companies, as you know. I see on the list many SVLG members, Google, Apple, Meta, LinkedIn. You've got titans like Salesforce here in the Valley. I'm curious now, as we talk about solutions and innovations, maybe first a global question. Where are mistakes being made? Not with those companies per se, but the organizations trying to move the needle on DEI. Where do you see organizations falling short, or what are the most common mistakes? And how do we move forward from those shortfalls to move the needle in the right direction?
And we've spent a lot of time looking at this. Again, I think our lens is, having worked deeply with 200 plus companies and 10,000 individuals, I think we've got unique insights, both into the things that are working as well as the things that are challenges, the traps that organizations fall into. And I think the key takeaway around where organizations are most challenged is that they're actually caught in a what I call a doom loop. Okay, and that doom loop starts with misreading the drivers of where they are today and why, and that speaks to how diverse employees experience the organization, what the and how that's different from their their white peers, and we're also kind of unclear on the root causes of their recruiting and retention challenges, and so in any other part of our business, we would actually get focus on getting smart about the drivers of the problem and obviously the opportunity as well. But when it comes to DEI, actually we actually are not well informed about those drivers, and we kind of take what I call kind of a moral equity approach. It's the right thing to do, so let's try to move the needle and do the best that we can. And I think that if you think about it, the way we, in any other business, what do? You rigorous analysis of where you are and why. Then you sort of say, okay, if we're trying to acquire a company, launch a new business, expand to a new market, we say, where do we want to be in 3 to 5 years? How do we define success qualitatively and quantitatively? And then we say, well, okay, given that definition of success, then what are the levers we need to invest in to give us our best chance of getting there? How do we prioritize those levers? What are the interim metrics we want to establish? And what's the organizational approach to getting there? That's kind of business 101. Right. And when it comes to DEI, the major challenge is that we don't do any of those things, right? We don't do the rigorous analysis of why we are where we are. And because conversations about race and gender are a little uncomfortable, we don't establish a clear definition of what success looks like in 3 to 5 years. And then when you don't do that, it's hard to prioritize your investment levers. It's hard you can't set any interim metrics that are meaningful, and you can't hold anybody accountable in terms of the organizational approach. So essentially what we have is a bunch of incredibly smart companies that are innovating in all areas of our society, that are approaching this with a different level of rigor when it comes to DEI. And when you do that, you essentially land with a strategy instead of tactics that are, you could argue, can be defined as sort of let's do better than last year. And there isn't one member organization that in the SVLG that would who has a CEO that would say that would be okay with if their senior team came to them and said, our strategy for the next few years is to do better than last year. And when you have a let's do better than last year strategy, unfortunately, then that leads to what we call random acts of diversity. A lot of initiatives, activities that on paper look good and individually are often very thoughtful, but are not bound in a cohesive strategy. That if you say, if we do these three, or 4 or 5 things and execute them well, then we're going to move the needle. So essentially, what we need is to elevate the level of rigor, with around the approach, and that fundamental problem is exacerbated when there aren't a lot of great benchmarks for organizations that are doing it, at a high level of rigor, and then when you execute with a low level of rigor, sort of let's do better than last year approach, guess what? The outcomes don't come, and then the confidence remains low, and that's really the loop that we've got to get organizations out of. Right? We've got to help them understand rigorous approach, give them the best practices and benchmarks, and then make sure that the outcomes are actually come from from that rigorous approach, and that's what builds confidence among senior executives that they can move the needle. So we just got to change this from a doom loop to a success loop, and that's really the core of the effort that we've taken on in my organization. To make sure that we move organizations from that doom loop to the success loop, both within the strategy, change management, tactics, but also supporting them with the executional efforts around talent sourcing, talent retention, and advancement.
Well, John, I love that doom loop to success loop. Clearly, it's a visual that paints the picture of where there are issues and opportunities that are acknowledged, but a clear path to fix them. And I want to talk about that rigorous approach. I think it's highly relevant what you've shared, as we heard from Melody Hobson and Enrique Lores earlier, that the tangible targets, the incentives are so important to driving change around DEI. The 25 by 25 program we've been talking about here at SVLG, it's all the same thing. And I think with Black Equity at Work, you're getting towards that comprehensive solution. But what does rigorous approach to DEI mean, and how do we tangibly implement that in our leading companies?
So let me give you an example by double clicking on our MLT Black Equity at Work initiative, and I'll start essentially saying that what we really set out to do well over a year ago was to try to move the needle on racial equity at among employers at a kind of systems level. Right? We have been working in our organization for several years, providing the kind of rigor that I just described within the context of our advisory practice, working with one organization at a time, right, like many consulting firms do. But we felt it was important to try to scale a kind of a systems changing effort, and where we found that the biggest gap was that we thought we could fill was. It was essentially the opportunity to establish for the first time a concrete and absolute standard for what racially equitable employer practices look like. Think about akin to the LEED standard, in environmental sustainability.
John, but just to clarify, so the audience understands, when you say a first standard of its kind, were there multiple standards that existed that were a patchwork? Or you noticed that this just across the board wasn't in place, and that's where your initiative filled the gap?
Right. It's really the latter, that there is no absolute standard. There hasn't been historically an absolute standard for what good looks like, okay, across people, across purchasing and suppliers, and across community engagement and philanthropy. And so in the past, yes, there are rankings and awards, but that have been out there in pledges. All of those are actually built around a relative standard, okay? And what we found after George Floyd was murdered, okay, and after so many great companies put out these, very strong statements standing against racism in all forms, and when their, Black and brown and even white employees stood up and said, "Hey, time out. We commend you for those important statements, but actually." That our lived experience within an organization that is really fundamentally inconsistent with what we're saying we stand for and stand against, right? And that was when we all realized, okay, that even if we were highly ranked on a diversity score, diversity ranking, publicized ranking, we were well below the bar of what is acceptable if there's racism alive and well in our organization. So we felt it was really important to, for the first time, establish an absolute standard. And when the great thing is, when you establish an absolute standard, then organizations can manage to that, right, with a level of rigor and accountability that they apply in every other part of their business. So this was really about trying to move on a systems level from a let's do better than last year level of rigor that's just not acceptable to comprehensive approach to moving the needle on racial equity, holding ourselves accountable in the process. And essentially the framework that we developed with the Boston Consulting Group and a number of other firms has 5 pillars, and they cut across, representation at all levels of the firm, to inclusive, anti-racist work environment, compensation equity, supplier and supply chain and diversity in your business practices, as well as community engagement and philanthropy. And the idea here is critical, that we designed this so that we would create an on-ramp for such that no matter where you are in the journey, you could be an emerging tech company with no diverse employees, a venture capital firm, a private equity firm, just at the very beginning of your journey, or you could be a consumer products company that's well along. That just doesn't matter where you are on the journey, but the first part of the Black Equity Work certification is actually developing, with our help, a rigorous racial equity plan built around the 5-pillar framework that I described. And that plan, first step is gets approved based on rigor alone, okay, not related to where you are in the journey. And then after you get the plan approved, okay, then you have the opportunity to, over the course of several years, to move the needle on that plan. Sorry, my dog's making noise over here. And get to a level of a threshold of points on a 100-point scale that where you get rewarded for being certified, okay, as a Black Equity Work organization. So the idea here really is critical, that we're calling organizations in, okay, not calling them out. Because we're providing that on-ramp that's accessible to everybody. And then all of the work that you do, is confidential. And if you don't make your initial goal in terms of points and so forth, then you're still working on it, but you don't get called out. Okay. So the idea really is about, all focused on helping organizations move the needle, and then providing the best practices that we've built and the insights that we've gained from working with, tens of companies one-on-one in our advisory practice. And we're excited about that. We've got really incredible momentum, over 50 companies that have committed to this, none of whom, interesting, I think, would say, they are where they want to be, but they're decided that they've stepped up to, to redefine how we approach this whole process, again, to take a comprehensive approach and hold themselves accountable. And it's a rigorous standard. And this is essentially, organizations putting in the work, acknowledging they're not where they want to be, but that's not the issue. It's what progress are they making? Are they taking a rigorous approach? And we think that's critical to investors. It's very important in terms of the establishing what rigor around the S in ESG. And it's really important to talent. And it's really important to your business partners. So we're very excited about where this can go. We see this scaling up to hundreds of companies in the coming years.
Well, it's an incredible effort. And as you say, the rigor behind it gives me a lot of faith that we'll see a foundation that's built for change. Right. I'd like to talk about, the business leaders we have operationalizing change, right, where they can apply their leadership principles to driving change around something like DEI that just isn't where it needs to be. Our summit is Innovating Equity. We're talking about the measures, the metrics, the methods that our companies are putting into practice to drive change in innovative ways here in Silicon Valley. You've got a partnership with Greylock. I know you work around, work with venture capitalists. That is not a space that I would view as being, frankly, very diverse as someone who's here and around the Valley. Tell me a little bit more about that and maybe the venture capital and those partnerships.
Yeah. So let me start by saying, that we believe that the tech, VC, and PE ecosystem, is one of the most important ecosystems that we need to transform in a good way to make more inclusive and more diverse, because it is simultaneously, the center of wealth creation in our country, and the center of wealth disparity. Okay, and And so we have a really intentional strategy to diversify all aspects of the ecosystem. And our starting point, the good news is we're really making great progress. We have 2,000 MLTers who are currently working in tech, and larger organizations, and even I think over 400 emerging portfolio organizations, and that's over half of those 2,000 folks are in the Bay Area, and we have about 70 MLTers who are working in venture capital, 12 VC funds that are founded by MLTers that have raised an aggregate over $1 billion. So all of them 50 million or more. So we've got a real strong base to build on, but we have a real 10-year strategy to transform the sector, everything from founders of color, entrepreneurs, to their venture capital and large tech companies. So that's context, and we began partnering with Greylock over a year ago because they they came to us and said, look, we want to play an important role in diversifying the ecosystem, and so we outlined 4 or 5 key areas that we're working with them on, and they include coordinating, establishing, making the tweaks as I talked about in the talent recruitment, talent acquisition, and talent management engines within Greylock. Okay, investor track roles in particular, as well as making the tweaks and getting more talent into their portfolio companies. Okay, those 2 areas, and then also helping to support and connect and accelerate founders of color so they can get into the venture capital funding ecosystem at places like Greylock and others, and in a deeper dive also in terms of the DEI practices. Okay, as I talked about earlier, the practices both within their portfolio and within their organization. And the last piece is that they've decided that one of the things that's going to be really important is to diversify their LP base. And we're operating nonprofit organization. We're not a bunch of well-heeled investors, okay, like the endowments and the foundations and the family offices that are largely LPs and major venture capital funds. But our work, we're the best at driving, at executing the engine that will diversify the tech ecosystem. So the extent to which an organization like Greylock, as they make money for their LPs, that supercharges our capital base and helps us do more work to diversify the ecosystem, then it helps to address their goals and their challenges.
John, I want to make sure we touch on this before we close, the perishability of this moment, right, and how we keep up the momentum. Clearly, what we're talking about here, putting rigor behind change, operationalizing change with targets and incentives, putting our business know-how behind driving much needed change related to DEI. Those are going to be the keys to success, the big takeaways from this summit. How, in your view, or maybe what would you tell our CEOs to ensure that the momentum behind this moment isn't lost?
I think it's really important for CEOs, to think about the importance of building on this moment to establish a what I would call a mindset shift that leads to a change in practices, and leads to winning practices with winning outcomes. And what do I mean by that? Very quickly, those leaders who do believe in equity, who are not racist, which is the vast majority, they need to move beyond what I think is a false narrative that has been established when it comes to DEI and racial equity. And that false narrative, essentially, that at the end of the day, it's them, not us. Meaning, it's the people of color, not us. It's a pipeline issue, or it's a performance issue, or it's the racist white people, not us, who believe in equity, or it's the government's role to address some of these persistent racial inequities in healthcare, in policing, in education, and so forth. I think the opportunity is for leaders, especially leaders who believe in equity, to take a rigorous approach. Okay. And in order to do that, we have to be well informed about why we are where we are, and what we need to do to move the needle. And at the end of the day, when we're well informed, okay, about why we are where we are and what we need to do to move the needle, then we will actually embrace the same level of rigor that we apply to everything else. And that actually will enable us to start embedding that rigor into our DEI and racial equity practices, as we do in all aspects of our business. So it's up to, I think, incumbent upon organizations like mine and others to drive forward and help, like I say, help drive organizations and leaders toward those rigorous standards and best practices, and share the insights that we have so that we can actually embed that rigor in everything we do. And that needs to be combined, candidly, with the incentives, as you talked about, for racially equitable practices. And those incentives need to come from investors. Those incentives need to come from talent themselves, and as well as business partners. And when this begins to work like the same equation in the heads of really innovative, smart leaders, that when DEI starts working with the same equation, then every other part of our business, then actually everything, that's when we will start to see the momentum pick up. So it's just about rigor, and it starts with moving beyond a moral equity mindset, moving to a business equity mindset, and then embedding those practices across the work that we do.
Thank you so much, John. It's an amazing conversation. We all are aware that we've got work to do here in Silicon Valley, but I don't know how you can't leave this conversation and this summit not being inspired about the progress we're making. Thank you, John. I want to ask you a fun question before we close out, and deeply grateful for the conversation. Is it true? Are you responsible for John Legend's music career? We read this about you in the research. I want to pose it to you while we've got you on live.
I can't take credit for John Legend's music career. It's his talent and hard work that's got him there. But I think the small world story is, that John John worked just before he became famous. For 2 or 3 years, he worked at MLT and helped us start the organization. And he used to be a consultant, when he was a few years out of college at the Boston Consulting Group, and happened to be on a team that was doing our initial business plan and strategy. And he did a great job. And he came up to me after the end of the project and said, "Hey, Johnny, I'm trying to, launch a music career, and I can't be traveling around 4 days a week as a BCG consultant. Can I come work for you?" And with some flexibility in my schedule. And I said, and he's a really brilliant person. I said, "Hell yeah, come on." And so he worked for us for 3 years, launched our undergraduate program, has been a great champion, board member, spokesperson for many years, and great friend. So we've been able to watch his rise as a recording artist, and as a multi-platform, icon. But we can't say, I certainly can't take credit for his success.
Well, I tried to give you an opportunity there, John, but again, thank you so much. And anything that we and our leaders in Silicon Valley can do to be supportive of your efforts, let's please stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Tracy Lee, Director of Public Policy at Lyft. We're pleased to continue to support SVLG and today's Innovating Equity Summit, and believe that summits like this are the key for continuing to make progress toward a more fair and equitable society. At Lyft, in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, amidst marches and rallies for Black lives, we committed to being a bigger part of the solution. We shared a number of goals in 2020 and have reported out the progress made. And while we're proud of what we've done, we know there's more to be accomplished. We plan to continue to focus on providing the means and mobility to help overcome the barriers and challenges Black communities face today. And we believe that through collaborative efforts and partnerships, we can close the gaps that currently exist. And with that, on behalf of Lyft and SVLG, we would like to extend our gratitude to everyone who contributed to today's summit. From our amazing keynotes and special guests to our panelists and sponsors. A special shout out to Zoom, who handled the production infrastructure which made today's event possible. And we also want to take a moment to thank our government officials, and of course to you, our audience. We hope you were inspired by the voices you heard today and are ready to continue acting on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can watch a rebroadcast of today's summit on Monday at svlg.org/watch. And for our members, if you're not already a part of the great work happening under the Racial Justice and Equity portfolio, be sure to email rje@svlg.org to get added to the listserv or reach out to the SVLG staff. From all of us who are part of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, we thank you and are looking forward to seeing you at our upcoming Higher Learning Summit on Thursday, December 2nd, 2021. See you all next time.